It was a Tuesday, but it didn't feel like one. Something about the air had shifted, like the world had been tilted a few degrees off its axis, just enough to make everything unfamiliar. My phone buzzed on the counter. Another email. Another thing I should have cared about but didn't. The usual momentum of my day. The grind, the push, the background hum of obligations was missing. The silence of it felt disorienting, almost loud. By noon, I was walking, though I couldn't tell you what I thought I was walking toward. The city felt different today. Its rhythm slowed, like a record spinning just a bit too slow. I passed the familiar landmarks, the bakery with the smell of butter and cinnamon wafting out, the bookstore with its cracked window and lopsided, help wanted sign, but I didn't stop. I just kept moving, letting my feet follow some invisible thread that seemed to weave itself through the streets. It was only when I crossed the bridge that I realized I'd left my usual orbit. I didn't come to this side of the city often. The streets were narrower here, the buildings older, stooped like elders leaning on canes. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and something sweet I couldn't place. I turned a corner and stopped. In front of me was an alley I had never noticed before, though it felt impossible that I'd missed it. It wasn't hidden, not really, but it seemed to bend the light around it in a way that made it easy to ignore. The walls were covered in murals, vivid, chaotic splashes of color that seemed to shift as I looked at them, as though they were alive. The alley pulled at me, the way a cliff edge dares you to step closer. It wasn't fear I felt, not exactly, but a sense of something larger than myself waiting at the other end. I stepped in, the sound of the city falling away as if someone had closed a door behind me. The farther I walked, the narrower the alley became, until the walls on either side were close enough to brush with my fingertips. The murals shifted as I moved, colors bleeding and blending, shapes forming and dissolving in the corners of my vision. At one point, I swear I saw my own face staring back at me from the wall, rendered in bright, impossible hues, but when I blinked, it was gone. The alley opened suddenly into a courtyard, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. It was like stepping into another world, one that didn't obey the rules I thought I understood. The space was vast, larger than it could have been, given the tight confines of the alley. The ground was made of shimmering tiles that reflected the sky, though the sky above wasn't the gray, overcast one I'd left behind. This one was streaked with gold and violet, as if painted by a hand that didn't know the concept of restraint. In the center of the courtyard stood a tree, massive and ancient, its branches twisting upward and outward in impossible spirals. Its bark glimmered like metal, and its leaves were translucent, catching the light and scattering it like fragments of stained glass. Beneath the tree sat a man, or something shaped like a man. His face was obscured by a mask, pale and featureless except for two dark holes where his eyes should have been. He held a small object in his hands, turning it over as if studying it. When he noticed me, he tilted his head, the motion slow and deliberate, like a clock hand ticking forward. "You're late," he said, his voice soft but resonant, as if it were coming from the ground beneath my feet. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mouth felt dry, my mind blank. He held out the object he'd been studying, a small, black cube, no bigger than a matchbox. "Take it," he said. I hesitated. "What is it?" His head tilted the other way, like he was amused by the question. "It's yours." The cube was cool and surprisingly heavy in my hand. As soon as I touched it, I felt something shift inside me, like a lock clicking open. Images flashed through my mind. Places I'd never been, people I didn't recognize, moments that felt like memories but couldn't have been mine. "What do I do with it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood, his movements impossibly fluid, and gestured toward the tree. "Climb," he said. The tree loomed above me, its branches twisting and curling like smoke frozen in midair. I don't know why I obeyed, but something in me knew there wasn't another option. The first branch was low, the bark smooth under my hands. As I climbed, the air grew thinner, heavier, as if gravity itself couldn't quite make up its mind. The higher I went, the more the world below blurred, until it was nothing but a smear of light and color. The branches swayed beneath me, but I didn't feel unsteady. It was as if the tree wanted me to climb, guiding me upward with subtle shifts and bends. When I reached the top, the world opened up again, and I found myself standing on a platform woven from the tree's branches. In the center was a pool of water, so still and clear it looked like glass. The man, or whatever he was there, waiting. He gestured toward the pool. "Drop it," he said, nodding toward the cube in my hand. I hesitated, the weight of it suddenly overwhelming. What happens if I do? His masked face was unreadable, but there was something like sadness in the way he stood, his shoulders slightly slumped. "You'll find out." I looked at the cube one last time, its surface smooth and featureless, and then I dropped it. The water rippled as it fell, the stillness breaking in a way that felt almost wrong. The world shifted again, the colors bleeding together, the air vibrating with a low, resonant hum. I closed my eyes against the chaos, and when I opened them, I was back in the alley, standing in front of the mural-covered walls. The city was loud again, its rhythm restored. The air smelled of damp stone and something sweet. I reached into my pocket, half expecting to find the cube, but it was gone. I turned back toward the courtyard, but the alley was empty, its walls still and silent. The murals stared back at me, their colors duller now, as if whatever life had been in them had drained away. When I got home, I found a single black tile sitting on my kitchen counter, its surface etched with symbols I couldn't understand. I don't know how it got there, or what it meant, but I keep it with me now. A reminder of a place that I'm not entirely sure existed. Have you ever stepped into somewhere that felt like it wasn't meant to be found, and left feeling like you'd only just begun to understand what you saw? The night the train finally came, I wasn't expecting it. Not anymore. I had stopped believing in the stories long before that night, though when I was a kid, I'd believed them the way only kids can, completely, without question. Everyone in our town had heard them, usually from some uncle who'd had a bit too much to drink, or whispered between kids on long summer nights when the heat kept us awake. The midnight train, they called it. The one that didn't follow any schedule, didn't appear on any map, and only came through town when it had something, or someone, it was looking for. The tracks had been abandoned for years, overgrown with weeds and bordered by cracked wooden ties. Nobody could even remember the last time a train had run through there. My dad used to say it had been during his childhood, when the town still mattered, when it wasn't just a pinprick on the map you drove through on your way to somewhere else. By the time I was born, the station was just a shell, graffiti-covered walls, broken windows, roof caving in from too many winters of neglect. But the stories stayed. Some said the train carried ghosts, lost souls looking for their way home. Others said it carried things far stranger, creatures that lived in the cracks between worlds, things with too many eyes or no faces at all. And some people swore it wasn't a train at all, but something that only looked like one, something old and vast that disguised itself in iron and steam. But the version that stuck with me most, the one that my best friend Leah whispered to me one sticky July night when we were 8, was that the train came for people. People who didn't belong. Not like bad people, she had said, her voice low and conspiratorial as we lay on her bedroom floor, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to her ceiling. Just people who feel wrong, like they're in the wrong place or the wrong time, or maybe even the wrong life. She'd paused then, chewing on her bottom lip the way she always did when she was thinking too hard. "You'd hear it first," she said finally. "A whistle, but far away, like it's calling for you. And if you go to the tracks, if you wait for it, it'll take you somewhere else. Somewhere you belong." "Where's that?" I'd asked, though the idea scared me. "Nobody knows," she'd said, "because the people who go don't come back." We grew up, as kids do, and the stories faded into the background, replaced by more immediate concerns. Tests, crushes, plans to leave our dead-end town. Leah was the one who actually did it, though, heading off to college in the city while I stayed behind, working shifts at the diner and dreaming of something more. We lost touch, not in any dramatic way, just in the slow, inevitable way people do when their paths diverge too sharply. I heard she got married, had a baby. I sent her a congratulatory text when I saw the announcement on Facebook, but she never responded. I didn't blame her. By the time I was 26, the idea of the midnight train had become little more than a strange memory from a childhood that felt further away with every passing year. Which is why, when I heard the whistle, faint and mournful in the dead of night, I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it at all. It was 3 in the morning, and I was lying in bed, staring at the cracked plaster of my ceiling, trying to will myself to sleep. The sound came again, softer this time, but distinct. A train whistle, long and low, like a call. I sat up, my chest tight. The tracks were less than a mile from my house, and in all my years here, I had never heard a sound from them. Not once. My first thought was that it must have been a dream, or maybe the wind, but something about it tugged at me, pulling me out of bed and into my sneakers before I even realized what I was doing. The night was heavy and quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you, makes you hyper-aware of every rustle of leaves, every creak of the porch under your feet. I didn't bother with a flashlight. The moon was full, its light silver and cold, casting sharp shadows as I made my way toward the tracks. I don't know what I expected to find. Certainly not what I saw. The train was already there, waiting. It was massive, its dark bulk stretching down the line, blotting out the moonlight. It looked old, impossibly old, its iron sides streaked with rust and soot. The engine hissed softly, steam curling upward into the night air. Its windows glowed faintly, but the light inside wasn't steady. It flickered, as though it came from dozens of tiny, unsteady flames. For a moment, I just stood there, staring. It felt like the air around me had changed, grown thicker, heavier. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The stories rushed back to me all at once, Leah's voice in my head. People who don't belong. I stepped closer, drawn forward by a pull I couldn't explain. The air smelled faintly of smoke and something sweeter, almost floral, but not quite right, like a perfume gone sour. I could see movement behind the windows now, shadows shifting and flickering, though I couldn't make out any details. The whistle blew again, softer this time, almost gentle, and the sound sent a shiver down my spine. The door to one of the cars slid open with a metallic groan, revealing nothing but darkness inside. It was an invitation. I thought about Leah, about the way her voice had trembled when she talked about the train, about how she always seemed to be waiting for something, even when we were kids. I wondered if she'd heard the whistle once too, years ago, in some city far from here. I wondered if she'd answered it. I took a step back, then another. The pull was still there, but it wasn't as strong now, like the train was letting me go. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching as the door slid shut again, as the engine hissed and groaned, as the train began to move. It didn't make a sound as it rolled down the tracks, disappearing into the night like it had never been there at all. I walked home in silence, the weight in my chest lighter now, though I couldn't explain why. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whistle, faint and distant. I don't go to the tracks anymore, though, not because I'm scared, but because I'm not sure what I'd find. Or maybe I'm scared of exactly that. Do you think there are places we're meant to find, but only if we're ready to see them? Places that call to us, waiting for the right moment, the right person? And if you heard the call, would you answer it? I was halfway through my second espresso in a tiny cafe in Budapest when a man with a crumpled map and a panicked expression walked in. The cafe was one of those charming but unassuming places tucked away in a side alley, the kind you stumble into by accident when you're lost or trying to escape the tourist traps. I'd been sitting there for over an hour, journaling and pretending to look introspective, when he approached my table and said, in heavily accented English, "Sorry, I need help. Very urgent." I looked up, startled. He was wearing a gray wool coat despite the late spring heat, his hair slightly disheveled like he'd run halfway across the city. In one hand was the map, in the other, a leather satchel that seemed far too heavy for someone his size. Before I could ask what kind of help he needed, he gestured wildly toward the map, which was covered in pin marks, circles, and a coffee stain that obliterated part of the Danube. "Do you know this place?" he asked, tapping the map with such urgency it rattled the sugar bowl on my table. I leaned over and squinted. The place he pointed to wasn't a famous landmark or anything I recognized. It looked like a random street corner in District 8, far from where we were now. Not really, I said hesitantly, but I could Google it for you. That answer seemed to disappoint him. He sighed, crumpling the map a little more as he slid into the chair across from me uninvited. This is bad, he muttered, more to himself than to me. Very bad. I am late already. Late for what? I asked, against my better judgment. There was something about his energy, frantic but sincere, that kept me from brushing him off. He hesitated, then looked at me like he was weighing whether or not I was trustworthy. Finally, he leaned in closer and whispered, "It is a delivery. Very important. Cannot miss the time." For a brief moment, I wondered if I was about to get roped into something illegal. Drugs? Stolen art? A black market pigeon delivery service? But before I could overthink it, he placed the satchel on the table with a thunk and opened it just wide enough for me to see inside. It wasn't contraband. It was books. Beautifully bound books, their covers embossed with ornate gold lettering in a language I didn't recognize. "Are you a librarian?" I asked, thoroughly confused. He laughed, a quick, nervous sound. No. These are for," he trailed off, searching for the right words. "A collector. A very particular collector." Before I could press for more details, he stood up abruptly. "Please," he said, pointing to the map again. "Can you come with me? I cannot find this place. You seem like you know the city better than me." I didn't, but the way he said it, like I was his last hope, made it hard to say no. And honestly, I didn't have much else to do that day besides wander aimlessly and take pictures of buildings. So, I grabbed my bag, tossed a few forints on the table for my coffee, and followed him out the door. The next hour was a blur of weaving through narrow streets, consulting Google Maps, which was about as confused as we were, and listening to him mutter apologies in half a dozen languages. His name, I learned, was Marek, and he was from Poland. He never explained exactly how he ended up in this situation, just that the books had to be delivered before sunset, or, as he put it, things will become complicated. When we finally reached the street corner from the map, it didn't look like anything special, just a row of old apartment buildings with faded paint and iron balconies. Marek stopped in front of one of the buildings, checked his watch, and let out a sigh of relief. "We are not too late," he said, more to himself than to me. Then he turned to me and said something unexpected. "You should come. It is better with two people." "Come where?" I asked, but he was already climbing the steps to the building's front door, fishing a small brass key out of his pocket. Against my better judgment, I followed. The apartment we entered was like stepping into another world. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old paper, and every wall was lined with shelves crammed full of books, from floor to ceiling. In the center of the room stood a small round table, and sitting at the table was an older woman with sharp green eyes and an expression that could only be described as amused. She was shuffling what looked like tarot cards, though they weren't any kind of tarot cards I'd ever seen. They were larger, their illustrations more intricate, almost glowing in the dim light. "Marek," she said in a voice that was both welcoming and slightly scolding. "You're late." "Only by a little," he said, setting the satchel down on the table with a relieved sigh. "And I brought help." The woman turned her gaze to me, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she could see right through me. "Help?" she repeated, her tone skeptical but not unfriendly. "Well, that's unexpected." I was about to ask what exactly I was helping with when she opened the satchel and began pulling out the books. One by one, she placed them on the table in a neat stack, muttering something under her breath that I couldn't quite hear. Marek stood to the side, fidgeting with his coat like a schoolboy waiting to be graded on an assignment. Finally, the woman looked up and smiled, a slow, satisfied smile that made the room feel warmer. "You've done well," she said to Marek. Then to me, "And you. Thank you for guiding him here. The books wouldn't have arrived without you." "Okay," I said slowly, "but what are they for?" The woman's smile widened. "Stories," she said simply. "Very old ones. Ones that needed to find their way home." I didn't ask what she meant. Something about the way she said it made me feel like I didn't need to understand. like the whole situation existed slightly outside the boundaries of logic and explanation. She handed me one of the books as a thank you, and before I could protest, Merrick was already ushering me out the door with a hurried goodbye. Later that night, back in my hotel room, I opened the book she'd given me. The pages were blank, every single one of them. But as I ran my fingers over the paper, I could swear I heard whispers, fragments of words and stories, just on the edge of understanding. I closed the book and set it on the nightstand, deciding not to think too hard about it. Sometimes, I still wonder what was really in those books, and who the woman was, and why Merrick had been so desperate to deliver them. But mostly, I just think about how strange and wonderful it was to be pulled into someone else's story, even for a little while. Have you ever stumbled into a moment that felt like it belonged in a novel instead of real life? This morning, while brushing my teeth, the mirror blinked. Not me, the mirror. It was subtle, just a quick, flickering motion, like someone on the other side had eyelids and decided to check if I was paying attention. At first, I chalked it up to the fluoride fumes messing with my head. Maybe I was still half asleep. I leaned in, staring at my reflection, trying to convince myself it had been a trick of the light. But then it blinked again. "Hello?" I said, because apparently, my go-to reaction for freaky bathroom phenomena is polite conversation. My reflection didn't respond. It just stared back at me, a perfect replica in every way. Same toothpaste foam, same unbrushed hair, same dark circles under my eyes. But then, right as I was about to convince myself it was all in my imagination, it smiled. And let me tell you, I wasn't smiling. The smile spread across its face like it was testing the waters, too wide and just a little too sharp, like someone trying to mimic human emotions without quite nailing the nuance. Then it tilted its head, a move so subtle it was almost imperceptible, and winked. Winked. I nearly swallowed my toothbrush. Before I could decide whether to run, scream, or just give up entirely and go back to bed, my reflection spoke. Its voice sounded exactly like mine, but with a kind of echo, as if it were coming from a hallway I couldn't see. Finally, it said, in a tone that suggested it had been waiting for this moment much longer than I had. I froze, toothbrush halfway to the sink. What do you mean, finally? Finally what? You noticed, it replied, leaning slightly closer to the glass. Its movements didn't match mine anymore, which was infinitely more unsettling than anything else that had happened so far. Most people don't. They go their whole lives without ever really looking. Looking at what? I asked, my voice wobbling in a way I'm sure it found deeply unimpressive. It grinned again, wider this time, like it had been waiting for that exact question. What's behind the glass? At this point, every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to leave the bathroom immediately, preferably setting the mirror on fire on my way out. But instead, I leaned in closer, because apparently, curiosity is stronger than self-preservation. And what's behind the glass? I whispered. Why don't you see for yourself? It said, and before I could answer, it reached out, through the mirror. Its hand emerged from the glass like it was water, dripping silver droplets that evaporated as they hit the sink. I stumbled back, my toothbrush clattering to the floor, but the hand stayed there, hanging in the air between us. Take it, it said, its voice softer now, almost coaxing. I've been waiting for you. Waiting for me to do what exactly? I asked, trying very hard not to sound like I was on the verge of hyperventilating. To switch, it said simply, as if that explained everything. It's your turn now. My turn for what? It rolled its eyes, my eyes, like I was the slowest student in a very frustrating class. Your turn to come over. I've been over here long enough, don't you think? Time to trade places. Fair is fair. Fair isn't. You can't just, I stammered, utterly failing to form a coherent sentence. I didn't agree to this. Sure you did, it said, and for a moment, its expression softened. You've been staring into mirrors your whole life, haven't you? Wondering if there's something else, someone else? You felt it. The pull. That's why I'm here. That's why you can see me now. I wanted to argue, to insist that no, I'd never felt anything of the sort, that I was perfectly content with my boring, mirror-bound reflection, thank you very much. But the truth was, it wasn't wrong. I had felt it. Those late-night moments when you catch your reflection out of the corner of your eye and swear it's just a split second off. Those childhood games where you try to see if your reflection will move when you don't. I'd always chalked it up to an overactive imagination. But now, "You're lying," I said, though the words came out weak and unconvincing even to me. "Am I?" it asked, raising an eyebrow. "Then why are you still here? Why didn't you run the moment I moved?" It had a point. Damn it. I glanced at the hand still hovering between us. It looked solid now, real, like my own but slightly shinier, as if it had been polished. Against every shred of common sense I possessed, I reached out and touched it. The moment my fingers brushed its palm, the world tilted sideways and I fell. Not back, not forward, but in. When I opened my eyes, everything was upside down. No, not upside down, reversed. I was still in the bathroom, but it wasn't my bathroom. The colors were all wrong, muted and washed out, like an old photograph left in the sun too long. The light bulb flickered faintly, casting shadows that didn't quite match the objects they belonged to. And then I saw it, me. My reflection, or at least the thing that had been pretending to be my reflection, standing on the other side of the glass, looking out at me with a grin that no longer felt like mine at all. "See," it said, tapping on the glass with one perfectly polished fingernail. "Not so bad, is it?" What did you do?" I stammered, pressing my hands against the glass. It was solid now, cold and unyielding. "What you asked for," it said, tilting its head. "You're here. You're free. Isn't this what you wanted?" "Free?" I echoed, my voice shaking. "I'm trapped in a mirror." "Details," it said with a dismissive wave. "You'll get used to it." I did. "What do you mean, you did?" I demanded, slamming my hands against the glass. "Who are you?" It smirked, leaning in close until our faces were almost touching, separated only by a thin layer of unyielding glass. "I'm you," it said, or I was, for a long time. "But now," it straightened up, adjusting its shirt with a little flourish. "Now I'm me again. And you're you. Isn't it fun how that works?" I screamed. It laughed. And then, just before it turned and walked away, it said, "Don't worry. Someone else will notice eventually. They always do." And that's when it hit me, the faint, nagging feeling that I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. So now I'm here, staring out at the world through the other side of the glass, waiting, hoping, because one day, someone else will notice. And when they do, it'll be their turn. Fair is fair, after all. The first thing I noticed about the envelope was how it didn't feel like it belonged in my mailbox. My usual delivery consisted of bills, junk flyers, and the occasional late birthday card. But this envelope was different. It was made of thick, cream-colored paper, the kind that whispered wealth and intention. There was no return address, only my name, written in a looping, old-fashioned hand, with ink that looked like it had been applied with care. I turned it over, half expecting some kind of seal, wax, maybe, like something from a historical drama, but the flap was unadorned. Still, it felt important in a way I couldn't articulate. Standing on my apartment's front steps in the cold, I slid my finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was a single card, blank except for a line of text in the center. "Tonight, 7 p.m. Leave your phone behind." That was it. No explanation. No signature. I flipped it over, thinking there might be something on the back, but the reverse was just as bare. I looked up and down my street, scanning for anything or anyone that seemed out of place. Nothing. Just the same rows of houses, the same cracked sidewalks, the same thin layer of frost glazing the cars parked along the curb. I thought about throwing the card away, whatever it was. I didn't have time for someone else's games. But then I realized I didn't have any plans for the evening, not even Netflix. Something about the note's simplicity intrigued me, gnawed at the edges of my curiosity until I couldn't quite let it go. At exactly 7 p.m., I left my phone on the kitchen counter, slid my keys into my coat pocket, and stepped out into the night. The air smelled like snow, though none had fallen yet, and the sky was a deep, inky blue that felt too still. I didn't know where to go. The note hadn't specified a place, and for a moment, I felt ridiculous, standing there in the dark like a child waiting for instructions. But then I noticed something. A soft light, barely perceptible, spilling onto the street from a narrow alley a few houses down. It wasn't the harsh yellow of a street lamp or the fluorescent glow of someone's porch light. It was softer, warmer, like candlelight. Without thinking, I walked toward it. The alley wasn't one I'd ever paid attention to before. It was the kind of space people ignored, too narrow for cars, too shadowed to feel safe at night. But tonight, the light drew me in. At the end of the alley was a door I hadn't noticed before, set into the side of a brick building I couldn't remember seeing. It was painted a deep forest green and framed by climbing ivy, even though it was the middle of winter. I hesitated. Everything about this felt surreal, like I'd stepped into a scene from someone else's dream. But before I could talk myself out of it, the door opened. A woman stood on the other side. She was older, with silver-streaked hair that fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and eyes that seemed to reflect the same warm light that had spilled into the alley. She didn't speak, just stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of spices, cinnamon, cardamom, and something I couldn't place. The room I stepped into wasn't large, but it was impossibly cozy, with walls lined in dark wood and bookshelves that seemed to curve around the space like a hug. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, and above it hung a mirror that didn't seem to reflect anything in the room. The woman closed the door behind me and motioned for me to sit in one of the armchairs near the fire. "I was wondering if you'd come," she said, her voice low and smooth, as if she'd been practicing the line for a long time. "You sent the envelope?" I asked, though the question felt absurd. Of course she had. She smiled, but didn't answer. Instead, she handed me a small cup of tea. The liquid inside shimmered faintly, like moonlight caught in water. "Drink," she said, her tone gentle but firm. I hesitated. "What is this?" "An invitation," she replied. "To what?" "To a memory that isn't yours. Yet." The way she said it sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't tell if it was fear or excitement. I looked into the cup again, the liquid swirling softly, like it was alive. Before I could change my mind, I raised it to my lips and drank. The taste was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, sweet, but not cloying, earthy, but not heavy. It filled my mouth, then spread through my body like warmth after stepping out of the cold. When I opened my eyes, the room was gone. I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ocean roaring below me, the sky above streaked with violent shades of red and gold. The wind whipped at my hair and clothes, and I could feel the salt in the air on my skin. There was a ship anchored in the bay, its sails tattered and its hull weathered by countless storms. Behind me, someone called my name. I turned to see a man running toward me, his face half hidden by the shadows of the setting sun. He was wearing clothes that didn't belong in this century, a coat with gold buttons, boots caked in mud, and his expression was one of relief and urgency. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't." The words stuck in my throat. I didn't know him, or at least, I didn't think I did. But the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing tethering him to the world, made me question everything. Before I could respond, the cliff beneath me shifted. I felt myself falling, the wind rushing past me, the ocean rising to meet me. And then, I was back in the room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the teacup empty in my hands. The woman was sitting across from me now, watching me with an expression that was both kind and knowing. "What was that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "A glimpse," she said simply. "A thread from the tapestry of something bigger. Was it real?" She tilted her head. "Does it matter?" I didn't know how to answer. My heart was still racing, my skin still tingling with the sensation of the wind and the salt. The woman stood, smoothing her skirts as she moved toward the door. "The first sip is free," she said, her hand resting on the doorknob. "But the next one will cost you." I wanted to ask what the cost was, but before I could, she opened the door and nodded toward the alley. The night was colder now, the frost thicker on the cobblestones. As I stepped outside, I realized I still had the cup in my hands, its surface etched with a pattern I hadn't noticed before, a winding vine that seemed to bloom as I stared at it. When I looked back, the door was gone. The alley was just an alley, silent and empty. I still have the cup. I still dream of the ship, the man, and the cliff. And every now and then, I catch the faint scent of cinnamon and cardamom in the air, even when there's no reason for it. I don't know if I'll go back, but I think the choice might not be mine to make. There was a laundromat I used to go to, tucked between a corner deli and a locksmith shop that always seemed to be closed. It wasn't the kind of place that invited much imagination. Grimy tiles, machines that clanged and groaned as if resenting the effort, and fluorescent lights that buzzed just enough to be maddening. But it was close to my apartment, and the dryers were cheap, so I stuck with it. I'd bring a book or my headphones, anything to make the hour feel less like wasted time. I never expected the laundromat to be anything more than a necessary stop on the hamster wheel of existence. Until it wasn't. It happened on a Thursday night, the kind of night where everything felt quieter than it should, as if the city was holding its breath. The place was almost empty, just me and a man in a heavy coat who looked like he hadn't slept in days. My dryer had about 20 minutes left, so I settled into the cracked plastic chair by the window and pulled out a crossword puzzle. I wasn't even halfway through when I noticed something strange. One of the machines, an older model in the far corner, the kind with peeling green paint, was shaking harder than the others, rattling against the floor like it was trying to break free. I glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed, but the man in the coat was staring into the middle distance, oblivious. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over, half expecting to find a pair of sneakers clanging around inside. But when I peered through the foggy glass door, I froze. There wasn't any laundry in the machine. No clothes, no shoes, not even a forgotten sock. Instead, there was a faint, flickering light, like the glow of a candle seen through a keyhole. It wasn't steady. It pulsed in time with the machine's rattling, like something alive was moving inside. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging up the glass, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. A landscape, maybe? It was hard to tell. It was dark, with flashes of movement, a tree branch swaying, or maybe water rippling under moonlight. I blinked, and the image disappeared, leaving only the flickering light. My first instinct was to back away, to chalk it up to exhaustion or the bad overhead lighting. But I couldn't. Something about it pulled at me, a thread I couldn't leave dangling. Before I could think better of it, I reached for the door and pulled it open. The machine stopped instantly, the rattling and flickering snuffed out like a switch had been flipped. All that was left was the hollow, metallic drum, empty as it should have been. Disappointed and vaguely embarrassed, I stepped back, telling myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But as I turned to walk away, I felt something strange, a cool breeze brushing against my ankle. It was faint but unmistakable, and it was coming from inside the machine. I crouched down again, hesitating before sticking my head closer. The breeze grew stronger, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and something faintly sweet, like crushed grass. And then I saw it. A small, jagged crack at the back of the drum, no bigger than a quarter. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. Through the crack, I could see stars. Not the reflection of fluorescent bulbs or the streetlights outside, but actual stars, tiny pinpricks of light in a vast, dark expanse. The logical part of my brain tried to reason it away. Maybe someone had left a phone back there, playing a video of the night sky. But the smell, the breeze, the way the air felt charged with something electric, it all told me otherwise. I reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the edge of the crack. It wasn't cold metal. It was warm, almost like skin. And then, before I could pull back, the crack widened. It happened so quickly I barely had time to react. One moment, I was crouched in front of the machine. In the next, I was falling. Not far, just enough to knock the breath out of me. I landed on something soft and damp, my palms sinking into what felt like moss. When I looked up, I wasn't in the laundromat anymore. The sky above me was a deep, swirling purple, dotted with stars that seemed impossibly close. The air was thick with the scent of flowers I didn't recognize, and the ground beneath me glowed faintly, as if lit from within. I could hear water somewhere nearby, a gentle trickle that reminded me of a fountain. I turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The trees around me were tall and spindly, their leaves shimmering like they were made of glass. And in the distance, there was a light, a soft, golden glow that seemed to beckon. I should have been scared. I should have been panicking, wondering how to get back. But instead, I felt calm, almost peaceful, as if I belonged here in a way I didn't fully understand. I started walking toward the light, my footsteps muffled by the mossy ground. The air hummed faintly, like it was alive, and with every step, I felt lighter, like I was shedding some invisible weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. The glow led me to a clearing, where a small pool of water reflected the star-filled sky above. In the center of the pool was a single object, a silver coin, resting on the surface as if the water itself was holding it up. Without thinking, I reached for it, my fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface. The moment I touched it, the world around me began to shift. The purple sky darkened, the glowing trees dimmed, and the hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the laundromat, sitting on the floor in front of the green machine. My dryer beeped in the background, and the man in the coat was gone. For a moment, I thought I dreamed the whole thing. But then I felt it, the coin, still cool and smooth, clutched tightly in my hand. I've kept it ever since, tucked in the back of my wallet like a secret. Sometimes, on nights when the world feels heavy and dull, I take it out and hold it, wondering if it's still connected to that place. I've gone back to the laundromat a dozen times, but the green machine doesn't rattle anymore, and there's no crack in the drum. Whatever door I stumbled through that night, it's closed now, but I like to think it's still out there, waiting for someone else who needs it. Have you ever touched something that felt like it wasn't meant for this world? Something that left you wondering if you just brushed up against a secret the universe forgot to hide? When I woke up, the moon was in my living room. Not a moon, not some moon-shaped lamp or sculpture, but the moon, roughly the size of a small car, glowing faintly and somehow wedged between my coffee table and bookshelf. It shouldn't have fit. My apartment isn't exactly spacious, and yet there it was, bobbing slightly like it was trying to make itself comfortable. The light it gave off wasn't harsh or cold. It was the kind of light you'd want to read under on a rainy afternoon. It had a presence, though, not oppressive, but aware. At first, I didn't move. I just stared at it, half expecting it to disappear like some half-formed dream. When it didn't, I cleared my throat, because apparently, that's what you do when a celestial body is casually lounging in your living space. Hello? The moon tilted slightly, almost apologetically, as if to say, sorry for intruding. It didn't speak. No deep, rumbling voice or cryptic celestial whispers, but I could feel its response in the pit of my stomach, like the low hum of a distant engine. The hum resolved itself into a thought. I didn't mean to bother you. I just needed somewhere quiet. Quiet, I repeated, because what else do you say to that? The moon shimmered faintly, and I got the sense it was embarrassed. The thought came again, softer this time. It gets loud up there. So many voices. So much pulling and pushing. I needed a break. I should have been freaking out. I should have been on the phone with someone, NASA, a therapist, maybe an ex who'd at least pretend to care. But instead, I found myself nodding like this was the most reasonable explanation in the world. I mean, yeah, I get that. Everyone needs some time to themselves, right? The moon seemed to brighten slightly at that, and I swear I felt it relax, if that's even possible. It was like the gravity in the room shifted, growing softer, lighter. I sat down on the couch, careful not to bump into its glowing surface. So, how does this work? Are you staying for long, or is this just a quick pit stop? The hum returned, and with it came a wave of melancholy so profound it nearly knocked the breath out of me. I don't know, it admitted. I've been up there for so long, watching and waiting, always tied to everything. Tides, time, dreams. It's exhausting, you know? No one ever thinks the moon might get tired. I leaned back, staring at it. It looked exactly like every picture I'd ever seen of the moon. The craters, the soft glow, the quiet beauty of it. But now, sitting a few feet away, it felt different. Heavy, in a way that had nothing to do with its actual mass. Yeah, I said after a moment. I guess people don't really think about what it's like to be the moon. What do you do for fun? The question hung in the air for a moment, and then the moon gave a faint, almost playful pulse of light. Fun? I don't think I've ever done anything for fun, unless you count making shadows dance on the ocean. That's nice sometimes. You've never had fun? I asked, sitting up straighter. Like, ever? No moon parties with other celestial bodies? No pranks on passing comets? The sun's not much of a prankster, it replied, and I swear I could feel it rolling its non-existent eyes. And the planets are distant, preoccupied. It's lonely work. Well, that won't do, I said, standing up and brushing the crumbs of last night's chips off my sweatpants. You're in my apartment now, and we have fun here. Non-negotiable. The moon didn't respond right away, but I could feel its curiosity. What kind of fun? I grinned. You're about to find out. First, I turned on my record player. Something upbeat. Something that felt like the opposite of lonely. The moon pulsed faintly in time with the music, and I swear the glow in the room got warmer, softer. I grabbed an old beach ball from my closet and tossed it toward the moon. It bounced off its surface, spinning lazily before drifting back toward me. The moon hesitated for a moment, then nudged the ball back with a soft shimmer of light. See? I said, catching it. Fun. We spent the next hour bouncing the ball back and forth, and though the moon didn't laugh, no mouth, obviously, I could feel its joy like sunlight on my skin. It started experimenting, pushing the ball into loops and arcs with little bursts of energy. At one point, it sent the ball into my kitchen, where it knocked over a mug. I could have been annoyed, but instead, I laughed harder than I had in weeks. Later, we moved on to other things. I showed the moon how to play cards, even though it couldn't exactly hold them, and we improvised a game where it pulsed its light to indicate which card it wanted to play. It had an annoyingly good poker face, probably because it didn't have a face, but I didn't mind losing. As the hours passed, I realized I wasn't just entertaining the moon. It was helping me too. I hadn't laughed like this in months, hadn't felt so connected to anything or anyone. There was something freeing about sitting in my tiny apartment, playing stupid games with a celestial body that had seen the entire history of humanity unfold. Eventually, the moon's glow dimmed, and I could feel its exhaustion settling in. Thank you, it hummed, the thought wrapping around me like a warm blanket. I think I needed this more than I realized. Hey, I said softly, leaning back against the couch. Everyone needs a break now and then, even the moon. The hum grew quieter, more distant, but not before one final thought reached me. I won't forget this. The next morning, the moon was gone. My living room looked exactly as it had before. Coffee table slightly crooked, a stack of unopened mail on the counter, and a faint ring of dust where the moon had been. For a second, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I noticed the beach ball, still sitting in the corner with a faint shimmer of silver light clinging to its surface. I smiled, picking it up and tossing it in the air. So now I have to ask, if the moon showed up in your living room, what's the first thing you do? I woke up to find a snail reading my calendar. A large, striped garden snail, perched comfortably on my desk, leaning slightly forward as if it had something deeply important to study in the box marked Wednesday. It wasn't moving, really, just sitting there in what I can only describe as judgmental silence. For several seconds, I just lay there in bed, staring at it. Not because I didn't know how a snail had ended up on my desk, but because I could swear its eye stalks were tilting back and forth, like it was nodding to itself. What? I finally blurted out. The snail didn't even flinch. Instead, its voice, a low, deliberate drawl, like the kind of professor who assigns 500 pages of reading but refuses to explain why, echoed across the room. You're behind on your goals. Excuse me? I said, sitting up so fast my blanket slid off the bed. The snail turned one of its stalks toward me. It was a subtle movement, but it carried the weight of someone dramatically removing their glasses to stare at you in disbelief. Your goals, it repeated, this time with more emphasis. March. Organize the pantry. Start jogging again. Revisit Italian lessons. It's January now, and you haven't done any of these things. I stared at the calendar. Sure enough, it was flipped to January, though I was fairly certain I hadn't flipped it myself. That's my old list, I said defensively. I never even got to it. That, the snail said slowly, is my point. It paused, then added, with what I'm almost certain was a smirk. Or were you planning to learn Italian while jogging through a perfectly organized pantry? Why are you here? I demanded, my voice climbing an octave. To help, the snail replied simply, with the air of someone who knew they were going to annoy you but considered it their moral obligation. I didn't even have time to argue before the window rattled behind me. When I turned around, I saw a fox sitting on the sill, peering in through the glass. Its fur was sleek and gleaming in the pale morning light, and it had this knowing look, like it had just heard the most delicious bit of gossip about me and couldn't wait to share it. "Let me in," it said, its voice light and sly, like a charismatic con artist in an old noir film. "No," I said immediately, because letting a fox into your house doesn't seem like something you say yes to, no matter how polite it's being. "Let me rephrase," the fox said, flashing its teeth in what I think was meant to be a charming smile, but came across as slightly unhinged. "I'm already here to help you, so you might as well let me in. Your self-esteem's a mess, by the way. What does that have to do with anything?" I sputtered. "Oh, it has everything to do with it," the fox said, and before I could stop it, it leapt gracefully through the window. Somehow, it landed without making a single sound, then proceeded to strut across the room like it had just entered a cocktail party. "For starters, you don't believe in yourself. That pantry you're avoiding? It's not the pantry. It's the metaphor. And don't even get me started on the jogging. That's, well, I don't want to say tragic, but it's tragic," the snail interjected helpfully. "Exactly," the fox said, flopping onto my chair like it owned the place. I wanted to argue. Really, I did. But I was suddenly very aware that I was sitting in bed, unshowered, surrounded by a pile of clean laundry I'd been planning to fold for 3 days. The fox noticed this, of course. It had an uncanny ability to zero in on my shame. "What you need," it said, stretching luxuriously, "is a system, and that's where I come in." "And me?" added the snail, though it didn't sound thrilled about sharing credit. "You?" I asked, torn between confusion and the creeping suspicion that I'd gone completely insane. "Of course me," the snail said. "I bring the wisdom, the patience, the long-term vision. And I bring the charisma," the fox cut in, "the energy, the pizzazz." It gestured dramatically with its paw, as if to punctuate this point. "What even is this?" I asked, looking between them. "Are you, like, my motivational animals?" The fox's ears twitched. "We prefer the term accountability spirits," it said. "Accountability spirits," I repeated flatly. "Yes," the snail said, its tone managing to sound both exasperated and condescending. "And if you don't mind, we'd like to get started. You've wasted enough time." "What exactly do you expect me to do?" I asked. "For starters," the fox said, hopping onto my desk with a practiced grace, "clean this disaster. You've got coffee rings on your journal and 3 pins that don't work anymore. How do you expect to succeed with this kind of chaos in your life?" "And the laundry," the snail chimed in. "For the love of all things mollusk, fold your laundry. You can't just show up and start bossing me around." I snapped. "Why not?" the fox asked, cocking its head. "You're clearly not bossing yourself around. Somebody's got to do it." I stared at them, speechless, and the room fell into an awkward silence. It wasn't until my stomach growled that the fox perked up again. "Breakfast," it declared cheerfully. "Excellent idea. I'll supervise. Make eggs." "Or oatmeal," the snail muttered. "Something healthier." Before I could protest, the fox leapt off the desk and bounded toward the kitchen, the snail somehow sliding across the floor behind it without any visible effort. They left me sitting there, baffled and overwhelmed, wondering how I'd become the reluctant protege of a life-coaching fox and a hypercritical snail. And yet, as ridiculous as it was, I felt something. A flicker of energy, maybe. The absurdity of their presence was strangely motivating, like they'd injected a kind of momentum I hadn't felt in ages. So here's my question. If two random animals, spiritual or otherwise, showed up to whip your life into shape, would you listen to them? Or would you chase them out of the house and go back to avoiding your metaphorical pantry? Because honestly, I think I might actually let these two stick around. The laundromat was the kind of place that felt perpetually stuck in the late 90s, with its faded linoleum floors, peeling no smoking signs, and row after row of machines that hummed and rumbled like a chorus of disgruntled robots. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the air smelled like detergent and warm fabric, with a hint of something metallic in the background. It was late. One of those nights when you can hear the wind rattling windows, and even the city seemed quieter than usual. I'd come here because my dryer at home had given up the ghost earlier that day, and I didn't want to start the week with damp jeans and sour-smelling towels. There were only 3 other people in the laundromat when I arrived. A middle-aged woman folding a pile of brightly patterned socks with military precision, a guy in a hoodie slumped in the corner scrolling on his phone, and an older man who was standing in front of a machine, staring at it as if it had personally offended him. I nodded to no one in particular, lugged my basket to the nearest empty washer, and began the mundane ritual of sorting whites from colors. It wasn't until I was loading my second batch that I noticed her. She was sitting on the floor in the farthest corner of the laundromat, her back pressed against the vending machine, a notebook balanced on her knees. She looked younger than me, maybe early 20s, with a wild nest of dark curls and a denim jacket that had patches sewn onto it in what I could only describe as controlled chaos. I couldn't see what she was writing, but her pen moved with this frantic energy, like whatever was in her head was spilling out too fast to contain. There was a paper coffee cup next to her that she kept reaching for without looking, her fingers brushing the rim before she took a sip. I went back to my laundry, but my curiosity kept pulling my gaze back to her. There was something magnetic about the way she occupied the space, as though she wasn't entirely aware of where she was. She didn't seem to care about the hum of the machines or the comings and goings of the other customers. Her focus was absolute, like she'd carved out a private bubble in the middle of this shabby, fluorescent-lit laundromat, and nothing could pierce it. By the time I'd switched my clothes to the dryer, the middle-aged sock lady had left, and the hoodie guy was jabbing at the vending machine with increasing frustration. The older man had finally wrestled his machine into submission and was now reading a paperback novel while he waited for his cycle to finish. And the girl in the corner? She was still writing, her pen moving so fast it was almost a blur. I couldn't help but wonder what she was working on. Was it a story? A letter? A diary entry about the surreal experience of writing on a laundromat floor at 11 p.m.? Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. I'm not usually the kind of person who strikes up conversations with strangers, especially ones who look as deep in thought as she did. But something about her made me want to know more. Maybe it was the intensity of her focus, or the sheer oddity of her choice to sit on the floor instead of one of the plastic chairs. Whatever it was, I grabbed a soda from the vending machine, partly for courage, and walked over. "Hey," I said, trying not to sound like a weirdo. "Mind if I ask what you're writing?" She looked up at me, startled, like she hadn't realized anyone else existed. Her eyes were dark and sharp, the kind that seemed to catalog every detail of a person in a single glance. For a moment, I thought she might tell me to mind my own business, but instead, she smiled. A quick, lopsided grin that seemed almost conspiratorial. "An obituary," she said, like it was the most normal answer in the world. I blinked. Whose? Her smile widened. My own. I didn't know how to respond to that. A dozen questions crashed into each other in my head, but before I could untangle any of them, she closed the notebook and tapped it lightly against her knee. "It's not as weird as it sounds," she said. "I'm trying to figure out what I'd want people to say about me when I'm gone. You know, like, what's worth remembering? It's an exercise in perspective." I stood there for a moment, unsure whether to laugh or back away slowly. She seemed to notice my hesitation because she gestured to the floor next to her. "You can sit, if you want. I promise I'm not planning anything dramatic." Against my better judgment, or maybe because of it, I sat down. The tile was cold and slightly sticky, and I immediately regretted not bringing my soda with me. Up close, I could see that her notebook was filled with tiny, cramped handwriting, some of it spilling out into the margins and circling back on itself like a maze. "So, what have you got so far?" I asked, because apparently, I decided to lean into the weirdness of this situation. She flipped back a few pages and scanned her notes. Mostly stuff I'd never want in an actual obituary. Like, she was terrible at parallel parking. Or, her pancakes were always slightly burnt, but she insisted it was intentional. She glanced at me, her grin returning. You know, the stuff people don't usually admit when someone dies. I couldn't help but laugh. "Sounds like an honest obituary." "That's the idea," she said. "No fake sainthood. Just the truth. The good, the bad, the weird." She tapped her pen against the notebook, her expression softening. "I think I'd want people to remember me for the little things, you know? The quirks, the habits, the stuff that doesn't sound important but kind of is. Like how I always sing off-key when I'm cooking, or how I keep a jar of jelly beans in my car for no reason at all. Things that make life feel alive." I nodded, feeling unexpectedly moved by her words. There was something strangely freeing about the idea of embracing those little imperfections, of celebrating the parts of ourselves that don't fit neatly into eulogies or resumes. We talked for a while after that, about nothing and everything. Favorite movies, worst jobs, whether ghosts would do laundry if they could. By the time my clothes were dry, the laundromat was empty except for the two of us, and the vending machine was buzzing softly like it was trying to join the conversation. I never asked for her name, and she didn't ask for mine. But when I left, I felt lighter somehow, like her odd little exercise in perspective had rubbed off on me. And as I folded my clothes at home, I started to wonder, if someone were writing my obituary, what would I want them to say? What would they actually say? And maybe more importantly, what were the tiny, unforgettable things I'd want to leave behind? The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not the usual city smells: hot pavement, distant exhaust fumes, yesterday's trash baking in the sun. But something altogether different, something alive. It was rich and loamy, like freshly turned soil after a rainstorm, with a faint hint of something floral I couldn't quite place. I stopped halfway down the alley and turned in a slow circle. The alley was the same as it always was. Brick walls covered in peeling posters, a few old crates stacked against the dumpster, the faint hum of neon signs from the main street. Nothing had changed, but the smell was undeniable, and it was coming from the manhole cover near my feet. I crouched down and peered at it. The metal surface was damp, gleaming faintly in the dim light. There was no steam rising from it, no sign of anything unusual except for the smell. I reached out, hesitated, then tapped the edge with the toe of my shoe. Nothing happened. The manhole stayed exactly where it was, heavy and immovable, just like it had been every time I'd walked past it on my way home from work. And then it opened, not like a lid being lifted, but like an eye blinking awake. One moment, it was a solid piece of metal. The next, it had split cleanly down the middle, revealing a gaping hole lined with what looked like moss and tangled roots. The smell grew stronger, and with it came a faint sound, like a heartbeat, or maybe the slow rhythm of a drum played underwater. Before I could decide whether to run or investigate, a voice drifted up from the hole, soft and low and warm. "Well, you're late," it said. I stared at the opening, then around the alley, wondering if someone was playing a prank on me. Late for what?" "For the appointment," the voice said, as if this were obvious. "We've been expecting you for weeks." "I don't think." The manhole interrupted me by yawning wider, the mossy edges writhing like they were alive. "No time for excuses," it said, sounding exasperated now. "Come along, then. You're holding up the line." I glanced behind me. The alley was empty, but the voice was right. There was a strange sense of pressure in the air, like something unseen was waiting impatiently. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer to the hole. A ladder had appeared, the rungs made of twisting vines that glowed faintly in the darkness. The smell was overwhelming now, earthy and sweet and strange, and the rhythmic sound had grown louder, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. "Down you go," the voice urged. I don't think this is a good idea, I muttered. None of it's a good idea, the voice replied cheerfully. But you're here, aren't you? Might as well see it through. I stared at the ladder for a long moment, weighing my options. On the one hand, climbing into a sentient manhole was probably the worst decision I'd made in years. On the other hand, curiosity won. It always does. The ladder felt warm under my hands, the vines pulsing faintly with a soft, golden light. As I descended, the air grew thicker, heavier, until it felt like I was wading through water. The heartbeat sound surrounded me, a steady, hypnotic thrum that made it hard to think clearly. The bottom of the ladder came faster than I expected. I stepped off onto a surface that was neither stone nor dirt, but something soft and yielding, like moss-covered wood. The space around me was dimly lit, the walls and ceiling alive with twisting roots that glowed faintly with their own internal light. "Finally," said the voice, now coming from somewhere behind me. I turned and found myself face to face with a creature. There's no other word for it. It was vaguely humanoid, its form wrapped in layers of moss and bark and flower petals, its eyes deep pools of glowing green. It looked at me with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and exasperation. "You really took your time," it said, crossing its arms, or what I assumed were arms. "The others were starting to worry you'd gotten lost." "The others?" I repeated. The creature gestured behind it, and for the first time, I noticed the room wasn't empty. There were figures everywhere, scattered among the roots and vines, each one as strange and unique as the creature in front of me. One looked like it was made entirely of water, its surface rippling with faint waves. Another was a flickering shadow that didn't seem to have a solid form at all. A third resembled a person, but with feathers growing in place of hair and tiny sparks crackling along their fingertips. They were all staring at me. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The moss-covered creature tilted its head. "Don't you remember? You made this place." "I what?" It sighed, a sound like wind rustling through leaves. "Humans always forget. You created this sanctuary, this refuge. It's yours. And now it's time to fix it." "Fix it?" I said, my voice rising. "I don't even know what it is." The water figure stepped forward, its voice soft and musical. "You don't need to know. You just need to feel. The cracks are already spreading. You'll see them soon enough." Cracks. My stomach tightened. I looked down at the ground beneath my feet and saw, for the first time, faint lines spidering through the mossy surface, the golden light dimming where the cracks spread. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you're the one who dreamed it," the moss creature said simply. "And if you dreamed it, you're the only one who can save it." I didn't have a response to that. What do you even say to something like that? The feathered figure stepped forward, its sparks dancing brighter now. "You don't have to do it alone," they said. "We'll help. We're part of you, after all." "Part of me?" The moss creature smiled, and it was both kind and unsettling. "Oh, you'll figure it out. Or you won't. Either way, the sanctuary needs you now." Before I could protest, the room shifted. The air grew heavier, the cracks spread wider, and the glowing roots began to dim. A pulse of light flickered through the space, and I felt something deep inside me respond, like a long-forgotten thread being tugged. I still don't know what this place is, or how it came from me, or why it's breaking. But the cracks are spreading faster now, and the creatures are waiting. I don't think I can leave until I find a way to put it back together. The first time I saw Aiden, he was throwing a chair out of a second-story window. It wasn't as violent as it sounds, though it definitely looked insane. The chair was this old, splintered thing that probably hadn't been stable since the 90s, and Aiden had apparently decided the quickest way to dispose of it was to yeet it into the alley below. I was walking my dog, Baxter, at the time, minding my own business, when I heard a crash loud enough to make both of us jump. I looked up, and there he was, leaning halfway out the window with his wild, unruly hair sticking up like he'd just rolled out of bed. He squinted down at me, realized I'd seen the whole thing, and said, completely deadpan, "It was an act of mercy." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just tugged Baxter's leash and kept walking, trying not to look back. But even as I turned the corner, I could feel his chaotic energy lingering behind me like an uninvited guest. A few days later, I ran into him again. This time literally. I was carrying a bag of groceries, and he came flying around the corner on a skateboard, headphones on, utterly oblivious to the world around him. We collided, and my bag exploded, sending apples and a carton of eggs flying. "Oh, crap, sorry," he said, yanking his headphones off as he scrambled to pick up my scattered groceries. He handed me a slightly squished loaf of bread and added, "I swear I'm not usually this much of a human wrecking ball." "Really? Because I saw you throw a chair out of a window the other day," I replied before I could stop myself. His face lit up with recognition. "Oh yeah, that was me. Small world. Did it hit you?" "What? No." "Good," he said, as if this was the end of the conversation. He shoved the last apple into my bag, then paused, squinting at me like he was trying to solve a particularly difficult puzzle. "You live around here, right? I've seen you walking that tiny horse of yours." "He's a dog," I said flatly. "Debatable," he replied with a smirk. And just like that, Aiden somehow wormed his way into my life. He lived in the same apartment building as me, though I hadn't realized it until the chair incident. It turned out he was an artist, or at least that's what he claimed when I asked him what he did for work. "I make things," he said vaguely, as if that explained everything. "What kind of things?" He shrugged. "Whatever comes to mind. Paintings, sculptures, sometimes weird collages. Once I made a life-size replica of a velociraptor out of soda cans. It's called Rexicle. Does that pay the bills?" I asked cautiously. He grinned. "Not even a little. I also fix bikes." From then on, I couldn't leave my apartment without running into Aiden in some capacity. He'd pop up in the lobby, balancing precariously on his skateboard, or appear out of nowhere in the laundry room, his hands covered in paint. One time, I caught him in the elevator with a trash bag full of what looked suspiciously like mannequin parts, but I didn't ask. The thing about Aiden was that he had this unshakable confidence, like he was completely comfortable being exactly who he was, no matter how bizarre or impractical that might be. It was frustrating at first, mostly because I've always been the exact opposite. I plan everything. I make lists. I have a 5-year spreadsheet for my life, color-coded and laminated. Aiden, on the other hand, seemed to exist in a perpetual state of improvisation, like he was surfing a wave of chaos and somehow never wiped out. I tried to keep my distance, but Aiden didn't seem to understand the concept of boundaries. One day, he showed up at my door holding a ceramic mug shaped like a turtle. "I made this for you," he said, thrusting it into my hands. "Why?" I asked, baffled. He shrugged. "You just seem like a turtle mug kind of person." I wasn't sure if that was an insult or a compliment, but I ended up using the mug anyway. It leaked slightly if you filled it too high, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it out. The more I got to know him, the harder it became to categorize him. One moment, he'd be completely ridiculous, like the time he showed up to a neighborhood potluck with a casserole dish full of gummy bears and called it postmodern lasagna. The next, he'd surprise me with these flashes of thoughtfulness that felt almost out of character. Once, when I mentioned offhandedly that I missed the bagels from a bakery in my hometown, he spent an entire day trying to make bagels from scratch. They were terrible, burnt on the outside, raw in the middle, but the gesture was so absurdly sweet that I ate one anyway. Eventually, I realized that Aiden wasn't chaotic for the sake of chaos. He was just curious about everything. He approached life like it was one giant art project, and he wasn't afraid to make mistakes along the way. The moment I knew I was in trouble, like real trouble, was when he asked me to help him paint a mural. He'd been commissioned by a local coffee shop to cover their brick wall with something cool and inspiring, and for some reason, he decided I was the perfect assistant, despite my total lack of artistic ability. "You'll be great," he said, dragging me to the alley behind the coffee shop. "Just follow my lead." "Are you sure?" "Because the last time I drew something, my 3rd grade teacher told me it was brave." He laughed. "That's perfect. We'll channel that bravery." We spent the whole afternoon painting under the sweltering sun, and despite my initial reluctance, it ended up being fun. Aiden was endlessly patient, even when I accidentally smeared paint all over the section he just finished. He turned my clumsy mistakes into part of the design, blending them in so seamlessly that you'd think they were intentional. When we stepped back to look at the finished mural, I couldn't help but feel a weird sense of pride. It was messy and colorful and slightly ridiculous, just like him. "You did good," he said, nudging me with his elbow. "Thanks," I replied, then added, "I guess you're not entirely insufferable." He grinned. High praise. Somehow, Aiden went from being the weird guy in my building to the person I wanted to spend all my time with. He made life feel less like a series of boxes to check and more like a blank canvas waiting to be filled. We're still opposites in almost every way. He's the hurricane, and I'm the storm shelter. But instead of clashing, we've found a way to balance each other out. Sometimes I think back to that first moment I saw him, leaning out of that window, and I can't help but laugh. I thought he was a disaster, and maybe he is, in some ways. But he's my disaster now, and I wouldn't change a thing. Have you ever met someone who made you question every plan you ever had for yourself? On our third date, Amelia told me she didn't believe in time. I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but her expression didn't waver. "No, I mean it," she said, stirring her coffee like it was a potion she was trying to perfect. "Time is just a story we tell ourselves to make sense of things. It's not real, not like we think it is." "Okay," I said, leaning forward. "So if time isn't real, how do you explain clocks? Deadlines? My fifth-grade history teacher yelling at me for being late?" She smirked. "Clocks are a human invention. Deadlines are a power play. Your fifth-grade teacher was probably just projecting her own insecurities." Then, after a pause, she added, "But you know what is real? Moments. Moments are everything." It sounded like one of those throwaway lines people say to seem deep, but with Amelia, it felt like she meant it. She always said things like that. Strange, slippery sentences that stayed lodged in your brain for days afterward. I didn't realize at the time how serious she was about all of it, or how that belief in moments, in their strange, fragmented permanence, would come to define everything about our relationship. It began with her box of trinkets. I discovered it about 6 months in, while helping her unpack some books. She had this old wooden box tucked in the corner of her closet, the lid painted a faded green with little gold flowers around the edges. It looked like the kind of thing you'd find at a garage sale and almost pass over, but Amelia noticed me noticing it and grinned. "That's my archive," she said. "Your archive?" "Of moments." She opened the box and pulled out a handful of objects. A concert ticket stub, a smooth pebble, the wrapper from a chocolate bar, a yellowed Polaroid of 2 laughing kids in Halloween costumes. She spread them out on the floor like they were artifacts in a museum exhibit. Each one of these holds a moment I never want to forget. I picked up the chocolate wrapper, examining the gold foil crinkled at the edges. It looked like it could have been any candy from any gas station. "This seems random." "Exactly," she said, eyes lighting up. "Moments are random, but when you hold on to them, they're not. They become anchors." She held up a small, purple ribbon next. This was from the day my mom braided my hair before my 8th grade graduation. I can still feel her hands pulling on the strands, still hear her telling me to sit still. Over time, the archive grew. A movie ticket from the first time we saw a terrible sci-fi flick and couldn't stop laughing through the overly dramatic death scene. A postcard from a trip we took to Maine, when it rained for 3 days straight, and we spent half of it stuck in a cozy motel watching reality TV. A bent key from the lock of the first apartment we rented together, which somehow jammed every single morning we tried to leave. At first, I thought it was sweet, a quirky little hobby that was so quintessentially Amelia. But as the years passed, I began to see how seriously she took it. If something mattered to her, she had to preserve it. Not just the big milestones, but the smallest moments too. The day she rescued a stray kitten from the rain and wrapped it in her scarf. The night I tried to cook dinner and burned everything so badly we ended up eating cereal on the floor, giggling like idiots. She started carrying a small journal in her bag, jotting down little notes whenever something struck her. "So I don't lose it," she explained. One summer, we went on a road trip through the Southwest, cramming everything we could into a beat-up hatchback. It was one of those trips where the world feels endless and full of possibilities. golden deserts stretching for miles, roadside diners with peeling signs and stale coffee, stars so bright they felt unreal. Somewhere near Sedona, we found this tiny cave carved into a red rock formation. Inside, someone had left a rusted tin can filled with little scraps of paper. People had written wishes on them, messages for the universe. Amelia pulled a pen from her bag and scribbled something without letting me see. "What did you write?" I asked. She grinned, tucking the paper back into the can. "It's not for you. Not yet." I didn't press her. She had a way of making you feel like every secret she kept was part of a larger, invisible tapestry, one you'd understand eventually if you just trusted her. As time went on, though, her obsession with moments started to feel heavier. She began insisting we pause in the middle of conversations or activities to absorb what was happening. "Wait," she'd say, holding up a finger. "Just take this in. Really take it in." If we were walking down a crowded street, she'd stop abruptly, eyes scanning the crowd like she was trying to memorize every face. At first, I played along, but there were days when it wore on me. Life, after all, moves forward. You can't pause everything. One night, after an argument that I can't even remember the cause of, I asked her why it all mattered so much. Why she clung to these fragments of time like they were sacred. "Because they're all we get," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You don't get to keep the big picture. You just get pieces. And if you don't hold on to them, who will?" She told me about her dad, how he'd started forgetting things in the last years of his life. Not big things at first, just little details, like where he'd left his keys or what day it was. But eventually it was names, faces, her. Watching him disappear like that, she said, it felt like someone had cut holes in the fabric of reality. Like everything that made him was just slipping away. I reached for her hand, but she shook her head, smiling through her tears. "It's not about being sad," she said. "It's about making sure that doesn't happen to us. To me. To you. I want to remember it all." We broke up a year later, though I think we both knew it was coming long before we admitted it. There wasn't any drama, no explosive fights or betrayals, just the slow drift of two people whose lives started pulling in different directions. She left the archive behind when she moved out, saying it was too heavy to take with her. I promised to keep it safe. Every now and then, I open the box and sift through the objects she left behind. There's a dried flower from a hike we took the weekend she told me she wanted to quit her job and go back to school. A tiny, folded paper crane she made during a blackout when we lit candles and told each other stories to pass the time. And tucked at the very bottom, the note she wrote in the Sedona cave. I unfolded it last week. It said, in her looping handwriting, "I hope I'll always remember this." I wonder if she does. I wonder if I do. And I wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was right all along, about time, about moments, about everything. I wasn't planning on staying at the library that late, but the rain made the decision for me. It had been one of those days where the weather couldn't make up its mind. Sun, drizzle, until the evening, when the sky cracked open and dumped a monsoon. The kind of rain that made rivers out of sidewalks and forced everyone indoors. By the time I packed up my laptop, it was already past closing, and the librarian was staring at me like I was the last guest at a party that should have ended an hour ago. I shoved my stuff into my bag, made an awkward half wave at her, and darted out the front doors into the downpour. That's when I saw it. In the shadow of the building, half hidden behind the bike rack, was a door I'd never noticed before. Not the front door, not an emergency exit, but a thick wooden door with an iron handle and a small, circular window. It didn't belong there. This was a modern library, all glass and steel, but the rain was making me desperate for cover, so I didn't overthink it. I yanked the handle and stepped inside. It wasn't a supply closet or a back office like I'd expected. It was a hallway, narrow and dimly lit, with walls made of rough-hewn stone that glistened faintly, as if they were sweating. The air was heavy and damp, with a faint metallic tang I couldn't place. I hesitated for a moment, torn between turning back into the rain and seeing where the hallway led. Then, somewhere far ahead, I heard a sound. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against glass. It wasn't threatening, just curious, tentative, and before I could talk myself out of it, I started walking toward it. The hallway twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. One moment, it felt like I was going uphill, the next, downhill. Sometimes it narrowed to the point where I had to turn sideways to fit through. Other times, it opened into small alcoves, each one filled with strange objects. A lantern that flickered without a flame, a globe that spun slowly on its own, a jar of keys with no labels or locks in sight. Each time I stopped to look closer, the tapping would grow louder, insistent, like it was calling me forward. So, I kept moving. Eventually, I reached another door, this one metal, with no handle. It slid open silently the moment I stepped in front of it, and I found myself in a vast room, far bigger than should have been possible given the size of the library above. The walls were lined with shelves, but instead of books, they held jars. Thousands upon thousands of jars, each one filled with a swirling, golden light that pulsed faintly, as if it were alive. At the center of the room stood a man. He was tall and thin, with a coat that looked like it had been pieced together from shadows and smoke. His face was pale, sharp, and utterly unremarkable in a way that made it impossible to describe, like my brain couldn't quite hold on to the details. In his hands, he held one of the jars, turning it over and over as if trying to read something written inside. "You're late," he said without looking up. "Late for what?" I asked, my voice echoing faintly in the cavernous space. He sighed, placed the jar back on the shelf, and finally turned to face me. "For this," he said, gesturing to the room around us. "You're here to make a trade." "A trade?" I repeated, bewildered. He stepped closer, and I could see now that his coat wasn't made of fabric at all. It was moving, shifting, like it was alive. Shadows coiled and uncoiled around him, restless. "Everything here," he said, gesturing to the jars, "is time. Moments. The ones people lose, waste, forget. They end up here, waiting for someone to claim them. That's where I come in." "I don't understand," I said. "What does this have to do with me?" "Simple," he said. "You've lost something, haven't you?" And the thing is, I had. I couldn't put it into words, couldn't even pin down exactly what it was. But the moment he said it, I felt the truth of it deep in my chest. There was a hollow there, an absence I'd grown so used to that I didn't even notice it anymore. Like background noise that suddenly cuts out and leaves an eerie silence behind. What did I lose? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly, almost pityingly. "That's for you to decide. But if you want it back, you'll need to trade something in return." He gestured to the shelves, and as I looked closer, I realized the jars weren't just glowing randomly. They each held something specific. A fleeting laugh, caught in midair. The warmth of sunlight on bare skin. The sound of someone saying your name for the first time. I could see them all, feel them, as if they were just out of reach. I stepped toward the shelves, drawn to a jar near the edge. Inside was the memory of something small, almost insignificant. A quiet evening spent sitting by the lake with my dad when I was maybe 9 or 10. We didn't talk much, just skipped rocks and watched the ripples spread. I'd forgotten about it completely until now, but seeing it again made my throat tighten. I wanted it back, desperately. "What do I have to trade?" I asked. "Something of equal value," the man said. "A moment you're willing to part with." It wasn't an easy decision. I thought about giving up something trivial, some wasted hours scrolling through my phone, or a boring day at work. But the jars wouldn't take those. Every time I reached for one, the light inside dimmed, rejecting the exchange. The man watched silently, his expression unreadable. Finally, I chose. It was a memory of an old argument, one that had spiraled out of control and ruined a friendship I'd thought would last forever. I'd replayed it in my head so many times, dissecting every word, every mistake, that it had burned itself into my brain. Losing it felt like a relief. The trade was instant. The jar with the lake memory warmed in my hands, and when I opened it, the light seeped into me, filling the hollow I hadn't even realized was there. I felt whole in a way I couldn't explain. When I turned to thank the man, he was gone. The room was gone. I was back outside the library, the rain still falling in sheets around me. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all, until I felt the warmth of the memory still lingering inside me, and the absence of the one I'd given away. I never found that door again, though I've looked for it every time I've passed the library. But some nights, when the world feels heavy and time feels slippery, I catch myself wondering, how much more could I trade? And how much would I be willing to lose? There's a peculiar, fleeting moment I've grown fond of, though I can never predict exactly when it will happen. It's that instant when you're doing something so ordinary, so forgettable, that your mind trips over itself and lands somewhere unexpected. The other night, I was rinsing out an empty peanut butter jar to put it in the recycling, scrubbing the sides with the kind of mild irritation that always accompanies the phrase, "This really isn't coming off." And somewhere between the sponge and the stubborn residue, it occurred to me, this jar will outlive me. Not metaphorically, literally. Whether it's recycled or dumped in a landfill, that little plastic cylinder is probably going to be around long after I've become nothing more than a forgotten username on some abandoned website. I stood there for a moment, holding the jar like Hamlet with Yorick's skull, trying to decide if I felt deeply existential or just mildly ridiculous. It wasn't exactly the kind of thought I'd expected to have on a Tuesday evening while wearing pajamas covered in coffee stains. And yet, the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Not just the jar, but everything we interact with on a daily basis. How many other things in my house and my hands would quietly persist long after I was gone? My phone case? My toothbrush? That one rogue sock I can never find the pair for? It's like I'm accidentally curating a time capsule for some future archaeologist who's going to be very confused about why I owned 3 separate avocado peelers. I think what struck me most, though, was the absurd intimacy of it all. These objects, these totally unremarkable, mass-produced things, are with me every single day. They're witnesses to my life in a way that even the people closest to me aren't. My reusable water bottle has been on more adventures than half the people in my phone's contact list. That jar of peanut butter? It sat in my pantry for weeks, patiently waiting for me to get through my almond butter phase. And now here I was, rinsing it out so it could, turn into a park bench or a novelty pin? There's something both comforting and unnerving about that. The next day, I started noticing it everywhere. My car keys, sitting on the counter, had probably spent more time in my hands than most of the books I claim are my favorites. My headphones, tangled in that same inexplicable knot they always form when left alone for 5 minutes, had overheard countless conversations, podcasts, and bad karaoke sessions in the privacy of my living room. Even my shower drain, gross, I know, was quietly collecting pieces of me, strands of hair that would probably fossilize into something if given enough time. It was as though every object in my life was trying to tell me, hey, I'm here too. Don't forget I exist. Later that week, I took a walk, hoping to clear my head. It didn't work. I found myself staring at the sidewalk, wondering how many people had stepped on the exact same patch of concrete. There was a faint smudge of gum flattened into the corner of one slab, a reminder that someone, somewhere, had carelessly spit it out without a second thought. And yet, here it was, immortalized in a way that person never would be. I started to feel a strange kind of kinship with it. Maybe I wasn't that different from the gum. Maybe we were both just passing through, leaving tiny traces behind without realizing it. That night, I went down an internet rabbit hole, as one does when trying to make sense of something that doesn't have a clear answer. I ended up on a website about objects recovered from shipwrecks. There were spoons, coins, bottles, and, most hauntingly, a pair of shoes. Still intact, the leather worn but unmistakably human. I stared at the image for far longer than I intended, wondering who had worn them, what their life had been like, and whether they ever stopped to think that their shoes might outlive them. Probably not. And yet, here they were, sitting in a museum display case, proof that even the most ordinary things can end up being extraordinary, given enough time. The following day, I decided to experiment. I grabbed a notebook and started cataloging the objects I used from morning to night. My toothbrush, my coffee mug, the pen I absent-mindedly chewed on while pretending to work. The notebook itself. By the end of the day, I had a list of over 50 items, each one so deeply embedded in my routine that I barely noticed it anymore. And yet, when I looked at the list, I couldn't help but feel like I was staring at a map of my life, traced in teaspoons and phone chargers. But here's the thing that really got me. None of those objects knew me. They were shaped by my life, worn down by my habits, but they didn't know me. My coffee mug doesn't know how much I love the sound of rain. My car keys don't know about the time I cried in the parking lot of a gas station because I thought I'd lost them. These things are, for all intents and purposes, just things. And yet, they carry a part of me with them. A fingerprint, a scratch, a smudge of peanut butter that wouldn't come off. That night, I threw the peanut butter jar into the recycling bin and felt a strange kind of relief. It wasn't just about the jar anymore. It was about letting go of the idea that everything has to mean something. Sometimes a jar is just a jar. Sometimes gum on the sidewalk is just gum. And sometimes, the things we leave behind are just things. Not monuments, not messages, just ordinary fragments of an ordinary life. Still, I couldn't help but wonder about the archaeologist. Would they ever find one of my jars? Would they try to piece together some grand theory about who I was, what I valued, based on the shape of a bottle cap or the color of a plastic spoon? And if they did, would they get it right? Probably not. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the story they invent will be better than the real one. Maybe it'll be funnier, more poetic, less about rinsing peanut butter jars, and more about something that feels important. What about you? If someone stumbled across a single object from your life in 100 years, what would you want it to say about you? Or maybe the better question is, what do you think it actually would say? I don't tell people about the lake, not because it's a secret exactly, but because it feels like one. Not because it's mine, but because it isn't. The first time I found it, I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was 12, maybe 13, and I'd taken my bike farther than I usually did, out past the edges of our neighborhood, where the streets thinned into gravel roads and the fields opened up like an unfinished canvas. There wasn't much out there. A few sagging barns, a rusted tractor half swallowed by weeds. The kind of place people forgot to remember. I don't know what made me stop that day. Something about the air felt different, heavier, though not in a bad way. There was a break in the trees along the road, just wide enough for a person to slip through, and beyond it, a faint path cut into the grass, overgrown but still visible. It called to me, not loudly, but insistently, the way curiosity always does when you're a kid. The path wound through the trees, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel, filtering the sunlight into fractured pieces. It wasn't long, maybe 10 minutes, though it felt longer in the way new places often do. And then the trees opened up, and I saw it. The lake was small, almost perfectly round, its surface smooth and dark, mirroring the sky so cleanly it looked like a second world. The waterline was rimmed with pale stones, worn smooth as glass, and the air smelled faintly of moss and something colder, metallic, like the edge of a coin pressed to your tongue. I remember standing there for a long time, just staring. There was something about it that felt, wrong isn't the word, more like untouched. Like the lake didn't belong here, or maybe I didn't. I went back the next day, and the next. I'd bring books sometimes, though I rarely read them. Mostly, I just sat on the edge of the water, tossing stones in and watching the ripples shatter the perfect reflection. The lake never seemed to mind my presence. It was always the same, still, silent, waiting. Once, I brought my older brother, Will. He was 17 then, too cool for most things. But for some reason, he said yes when I asked him to come. Maybe he felt sorry for me. I was the quiet one, the odd one. And even though he didn't understand me, I think he wanted to. This place is weird, he said, squinting at the water like it was hiding something from him. It's peaceful, I replied. It's too quiet. We stayed for maybe half an hour before he got bored and wandered back to the car. I didn't bring him again. By the time I was 16, the lake had become my refuge, my escape. When things got too loud at home, my parents shouting over something I never understood, while slamming doors, the hum of a house that never quite felt settled, I'd slip away to the lake. It wasn't that it solved anything, but it made the noise feel farther away, like a storm on the other side of a mountain. The summer after Will left for college, I went to the lake almost every day. I didn't realize until much later how much I missed him, how the absence of his loud, easy presence left a hole in the house I didn't know how to fill. I'd sit by the water, tossing stones and watching the sky change, feeling the weight of everything I couldn't name pressing down on my chest. That was the first time I saw something in the lake. It was just a flicker at first, a shadow moving beneath the surface. I thought it was a fish, though I'd never seen anything alive in the water before. No minnows, no dragonflies, not even algae. But this was bigger than a fish. It moved slowly, deliberately, circling the center of the lake like it was tracing some invisible pattern. I didn't tell anyone about it, not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't want them to. The lake was mine, and whatever was in it belonged to me too, even if I didn't understand it. Over the next few weeks, the shadow came more often. I'd see it gliding beneath the surface, sometimes close enough to the edge that I could almost make out its shape. It was long, sinuous, its movements impossibly smooth, like smoke in a jar. Once, it came so close that I leaned over the water, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to see it clearly. The water rippled, and for a moment, I thought I saw an eye, round, unblinking, too big to belong to anything natural. And then it was gone. I stopped going to the lake for a while after that. Not because I was scared, exactly, but because I didn't know what to do with the feeling it left me with, that electric hum of something too big, too strange, pressing against the edges of my understanding. But the lake pulled me back, as it always did. It was late September when I returned, the air cooler, the trees shedding their first few leaves. The lake was as I'd left it, still, silent, waiting. I sat on the stones, my breath visible in the crisp air, and for the first time, I spoke to it. "I know you're there," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "I don't know what you are, but I don't think you want to hurt me." The water rippled, just slightly, as if in response. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting for something to happen. Hours, maybe. The shadows grew longer, the sky fading into deep blue, and just as I was about to leave, the water moved. It wasn't the shadow this time. It was the water itself, rising up like it had forgotten it was supposed to stay flat, shaping itself into something that wasn't quite solid but wasn't liquid anymore either. It shimmered in the moonlight, impossibly tall, its surface shifting and rippling like silk. And then it spoke. Not in words, exactly, but in a way that filled my head with images, feelings, impressions. I saw the lake as it had been long ago, surrounded by endless forest, untouched by human hands. I felt its loneliness, its longing, its strange, quiet intelligence that didn't think the way we did but still understood. It asked me something then, though not in words. It wanted to know if I would stay. Not forever, but for a while. Long enough to keep it company. I said yes. I don't go to the lake as often now. Not because I've outgrown it, but because I don't need it the way I used to. But when I do go, the shadow is always there, circling beneath the surface, and the water always seems to ripple in greeting. I don't tell people about the lake, not because it's a secret, exactly, but because it feels like one. And some secrets, I think, are meant to be kept. There's a secondhand bookstore tucked into the far end of an alley downtown, the kind of place you'd only find if you were either lost or looking for it on purpose. The sign above the door is barely legible, faded gold paint peeling away from dark wood. But if you squint hard enough, you can make out the words, "The Shelf Between Worlds." I'd passed by it 100 times and never thought to go inside. But last Saturday, something made me stop. I don't know if it was the faint, musty smell that seemed to drift out from the cracked door, or the crooked way the light from inside spilled onto the damp cobblestones, like it had been sitting there waiting for me. Either way, I stepped inside. The air was thick and warm, heavy with the smell of old paper and leather bindings. The shelves stretched up so high that they disappeared into shadows, leaning slightly as if the weight of their contents had warped them over the years. Books were stacked everywhere, on the floor, on tables, on shelves that seemed to exist only for the sake of chaos. There were no signs, no categories, no logic to the layout. Just books. An ocean of them, stretching endlessly in every direction. And the strangest part? There was no one else there. No customers, no clerk behind the counter. Just the faint sound of creaking wood, as if the building itself was breathing. I wandered deeper into the store, my fingers trailing across spines that were soft with age. Some of the titles were familiar: Shakespeare, Dickens, Austen, but most of them were strange, written in languages I couldn't read or etched in alphabets I didn't recognize. One book had no title at all, just a rough leather cover that looked as if it had been clawed by something sharp. I picked it up and flipped through its pages, only to find them completely blank. Still, the weight of it in my hands made my chest tighten, as if it were holding something more than paper and thread. I put it back carefully, half expecting it to hum or whisper as I walked away. The farther I wandered, the stranger the books became. One shelf was lined with tiny volumes no bigger than a matchbox, their pages so delicate I was afraid they'd crumble if I touched them. Another held books bound in materials that didn't look like leather or cloth. Smooth, glossy covers that felt cool to the touch, as if they were alive. There were books that smelled faintly of salt water, books that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, books with locks on their covers and no visible keyholes. It was overwhelming, like standing in the middle of someone else's dream, and I might have left right then if I hadn't noticed the sound. A faint clicking, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, expecting to see someone, a customer, a worker, anyone, but there was no one there. Just an old typewriter sitting on a low wooden table, its keys moving on their own. The ribbon was fresh, the paper crisp and white, and as I watched, letters began to appear on the page, one by one, slow and deliberate. At first, the words didn't make sense, just fragments, scattered phrases that seemed to mean nothing. The door is always open. What we lose, we keep. Turn the page before the ink dries. But then, as the clicking continued, the words began to form sentences, and those sentences began to tell a story. My story. It started with things I'd forgotten. Small moments, long buried in the clutter of years. The time I'd climbed the oak tree in my backyard and ripped my jeans on a branch, only to lie to my mom and say I fell off my bike. The birthday party when I got my first journal, the one with the lock I could never quite figure out how to open. The time I stayed up all night reading under my covers with a flashlight, my fingers trembling with excitement every time I turned the page. I stared at the typewriter, my pulse pounding in my ears, because there was no way it could know these things. But it did. The story continued, moving forward in time, pulling up memories I hadn't even realized I'd buried. My first crush, my first heartbreak, the sharp sting of losing a friend, and the even sharper sting of realizing I'd been the one to let them go. It was all there, spelled out in neat black letters, every detail achingly precise. And then it started writing things I didn't remember, moments that hadn't happened yet. The clicking slowed as the sentences unfolded, and I felt a lump rise in my throat as I read them. They were small, ordinary things. A phone call I hadn't made but knew I needed to. A walk by the river I hadn't taken yet but suddenly longed for. A face I didn't recognize but felt sure I would someday. Lit up by laughter under a sky full of stars. It wasn't a prophecy, exactly. It didn't feel like fate or destiny. It felt like possibility, like a door being left ajar, waiting for me to choose whether to step through it. When the typewriter finally stopped, I stood there for a long time, staring at the page. The final words were simple, almost too simple. The rest is yours to write. I reached out to pull the page free, but before my fingers touched it, the typewriter gave a sharp, mechanical whir and the paper slid back inside, vanishing into its depths. The clicking started again, faster this time, but no words appeared on the blank page. Just the sound, steady and endless, as if it were waiting for me to leave. I walked out of the shop in a daze, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. When I turned back to look at the door, the sign above it was gone, and the windows were dark. I tried to retrace my steps the next day, searching for the alley, for the faint gold letters, for anything that might prove the store had been real. But there was nothing, just a stretch of brick wall and the distant hum of traffic. I don't know what I found that night, or why it let me in, but sometimes, when the air feels heavy and the city is quiet, I swear I can still hear the faint clicking of those keys, like the echo of a story still waiting to be told. Have you ever felt like you stumbled into a moment that wasn't meant for you, but somehow belonged to you anyway? I have this strange habit when I develop feelings for someone. I start imagining what they'd be like in a disaster. Not just any disaster, mind you. I'm talking about the big, cinematic, world-ending type. Zombie apocalypse, alien invasion, volcanic eruption in the middle of the city. I don't know why my brain does this, but it's like my subconscious insists that I test their survival skills before we've even gone on a date. Forget romantic fantasies of picnics in the park or candlelit dinners. No, my crush gets dropped straight into the apocalypse in my head, and I get to decide whether they'd make it out alive or get eaten by a zombie 5 minutes in. Take this guy, Matt, for example. I met him at my friend's trivia night, where he impressed everyone by knowing the obscure Latin name for a species of jellyfish. He had this easygoing smile and a tendency to lean forward when he talked, like whatever you were saying was the most important thing in the room. Naturally, I fell for him, hard. But before I could even consider asking him out, my brain needed to know. Could Matt handle himself in a zombie apocalypse? The scenario unfolded as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. The outbreak would happen while we were at trivia night, obviously. Zombies bursting through the door mid-question about 18th century British literature. Everyone would panic, and I'd see Matt leap into action. In my imagination, he'd grab a chair and smash it over the head of the nearest zombie, cool as a cucumber. But then I paused. Would he really? He didn't strike me as the violent type. No, Matt would probably try to reason with the zombies, maybe attempt to distract them with some fact about the mating habits of jellyfish. It'd work, temporarily, but then he'd get bitten while trying to save some random stranger. I sighed at my ceiling, disappointed. Matt seemed like a great guy, but apocalypse material? Questionable. It's not just zombies either. My crush scenarios span all genres of disaster. When I liked my coworker Laura, I spent weeks mentally inserting her into an alien invasion. In my head, the aliens arrived in these giant chrome orbs that hovered over major cities, beaming people up at random. Laura, with her unshakable composure and tendency to carry weirdly specific tools in her purse, a flashlight, a tiny multi-tool, a pocket notebook, would totally MacGyver her way out of the spaceship. She'd figure out the alien technology in record time, disable the tractor beam, and save an entire city block. She'd probably do it all while wearing her usual cardigan and sipping a matcha latte. But not every crush survives these tests. There was a guy I once dated who failed the volcano scenario so miserably, I couldn't look at him the same way afterward. His name was Greg, and he was one of those guys who took pride in being laid back. He liked to say things like, "Why stress? Everything works itself out in the end." It was charming at first, but then one day, during a particularly dull work meeting, I imagined the two of us on a city street as a volcano erupted nearby. Lava was pouring down the hill. People were screaming, and Greg was just standing there, staring at the lava, saying, "Wow, this is wild. Nature. Huh?" I imagined myself yanking his arm, trying to drag him to safety, but he'd refused to run, insisting that we should just see where it goes. I dumped Greg 3 weeks later. He never saw it coming, and I couldn't exactly explain that his imagined volcanic demise had killed my attraction. The thing is, I'm not sure why I do this. It's not like I genuinely expect the world to end anytime soon, though given the state of things, who knows? Maybe it's my way of figuring out who people really are, beyond the small talk and niceties. Because, let's face it, everyone's on their best behavior during the early stages of getting to know someone. They're charming, funny, polite, but you throw a horde of zombies at them, even hypothetically, and suddenly the truth comes out. Are they brave? Resourceful? Selfish? The kind of person who'd share their last can of beans? Or the kind who'd push you in front of a zombie to save themselves? Sometimes, though, these scenarios backfire on me. Like with Sophia, a girl I met in my book club. She had this quiet confidence, the kind of person who could sit in silence and make you feel like it wasn't awkward at all. I liked her instantly. Naturally, my brain put her into a desert survival scenario. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, our car broken down, vultures circling overhead. Sophia took charge, of course, fashioning a makeshift shade structure out of the car's sun visors and rationing out the last of our water. I imagined her calmly explaining which plants were edible as we hiked towards safety. Her cheeks flushed from the heat, but her spirit unbroken. She was a total badass. But then I made the mistake of mentioning survival scenarios during one of our book club meetings. We were discussing The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and I casually asked, "What would you do in an apocalypse? Like, let's say society collapses tomorrow. What's your game plan?" Sophia wrinkled her nose and said, "Oh, I'd probably just die right away. I'm not really built for that kind of thing." I laughed, but inside, I was spiraling. Die right away? The woman who, in my head, had just led us out of the desert? It threw my entire mental narrative into chaos. I couldn't reconcile the real Sophia with the badass survivor Sophia I'd invented, and it made me wonder if I'd been falling for the person she actually was, or the disaster movie version of her I'd conjured up. At this point, I've started to accept that this is just how my brain works. It's not about judging people or holding them to some imaginary standard. It's more like, I want to know how they'd react when things get hard. Not lava spewing, alien invading hard, necessarily, but the metaphorical kind. When life throws curveballs, when the road gets rough, when things aren't easy. Are they the kind of person who rises to the occasion? Who stays calm under pressure? Who doesn't give up, even when everything feels impossible? I guess disaster scenarios are just my shorthand for figuring that out. So, if I've ever liked you, there's a good chance I've imagined you wielding a baseball bat during a zombie apocalypse or hacking an alien spaceship with a pocket knife. And honestly, if you manage to survive, congratulations, you're already ahead of most people. But I can't be the only one who does this, right? What about you? Do you have any weird, secret ways of testing your crushes? Or am I just out here, single-handedly directing an imaginary disaster movie starring everyone I've ever liked? The city was built on layers that never quite settled. Beneath every street, every corner, there were traces of what came before. Cobblestones swallowed by asphalt, signs painted over but still faintly visible, the bones of forgotten things pressing up just enough to remind you they were still there. Walking through it always felt to me like trying to read a book written in a language I didn't know, where the letters shifted when you blinked. Some days, the place felt alive with stories that hummed just under the surface, waiting for someone to listen. Other days, it was all noise, traffic, footsteps, the clatter of trains, and no one could hear a damn thing. Today, it was something else entirely. I was on my way to the old bookstore by the river. One of those places you only find if you're looking for it, or maybe if it's looking for you. The kind of shop where the smell of paper has soaked into the walls, where the owner knows the location of every single book, but acts like they don't because they enjoy the hunt as much as you do. I didn't need anything specific, but that was the point. There's a kind of magic in walking through aisles of mismatched shelves, running your fingers along the spines until something catches you. It feels like making a deal with the universe. I'll find what I didn't know I was looking for, and in return, I'll pretend it was fate. The morning had been quiet in that heavy, expectant way that comes before a storm, though the sun was still holding on for now. The streets were unusually empty, as if the city had taken a deep breath and forgotten to exhale. I passed a row of parked bikes chained to a fence, their tires wet from the condensation that gathered overnight. One of them still had an old playing card pinned to its spokes, an 8 of hearts, its edges warped from rain. It was the kind of thing that would have delighted me as a kid, back when every little detail felt like a clue to some larger mystery. For a moment, I considered unpinning it, slipping it into my pocket. But then I thought better of it. Whoever left it there might come back. Or maybe it was meant for someone else entirely. I reached the bookstore just as a man was stepping out, clutching a bundle of books tied together with twine. He gave me a nod as we passed each other, and I caught a glimpse of his haul. Mostly old paperbacks, their covers faded to the same soft beige that time seems to favor. He had the look of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for, but wouldn't tell you if you asked. I imagined him sitting in some cluttered apartment later, surrounded by stacks of books that leaned like crooked towers, their contents spilling into his life one story at a time. Inside, the shop was a maze of half-filled shelves and precarious piles. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and something else. Clove cigarettes, maybe? That seemed to cling to the place like a second skin. The owner, a wiry man with silver hair that stuck out in all directions, was perched on a stool behind the counter, scribbling in a notebook. He didn't look up when I walked in, which I appreciated. Some people need to be welcomed into a space, but I prefer to slip in unnoticed, like a shadow looking for a place to settle. I wandered through the aisles aimlessly, picking up books at random and flipping through their pages. A volume of poetry with someone's handwriting scrawled in the margins. A hardcover mystery with the dust jacket missing and a faint coffee ring on the cover. A children's book about sea monsters that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. There was something oddly comforting about the randomness of it all, as though each book had been waiting for years to be held by someone, anyone, who might see it for what it was. Then I saw it, a thin, leather-bound journal wedged between two thick atlases. It didn't have a title on the spine, just a faint embossed design. A crescent moon wrapped in vines. I pulled it off the shelf and opened it to the first page, expecting blank paper, but instead, I found handwriting. Messy, looping script that looked as though the writer had been in a hurry. The ink had bled slightly, as if it had been written in a damp place. There was no introduction, no explanation, just the first line. If you found this, you're already part of it. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the words, trying to decide if I was supposed to feel intrigued or unsettled. Part of what? A story? A joke? Some elaborate prank left by a bored student decades ago? I flipped through the pages, careful not to let the binding crack, and found more writing, though none of it made much sense. Lists of dates, scattered observations about the weather, strange phrases like, "The sky was too loud today," and "Don't trust the man with the red umbrella." Some pages had drawings, rough sketches of places I didn't recognize, symbols that looked like they belonged in some forgotten language. I was about to close the journal and put it back when something slipped out from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. A photograph, black and white, slightly curled at the edges, with a faint crease running diagonally across the middle. It showed a street corner at night, illuminated by a single flickering lamppost. The ground was wet, and there was a shadow just at the edge of the frame. The kind of shape that could have been a person but wasn't quite distinct enough to say for sure. On the back, written in the same hurried handwriting as the journal, was a single sentence. "Meet me where the light bends." I stared at the photo, the words, the journal in my hand, and felt a strange pull in my chest. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something close to it. Curiosity with an edge. I wanted to laugh it off, to tell myself it was just someone's forgotten attempt at creating a mystery where none existed. But a part of me, the part that still believed in clues and cards and bike spokes, wanted to follow it. Just to see. I brought the journal to the counter. The owner glanced up from his notebook and raised an eyebrow. "Interesting choice," he said, his voice dry but not unfriendly. "Do you know who left this here?" I asked, holding up the journal. He shook his head. "Things show up all the time. People trade books, leave things behind. This place collects what it wants, I suppose." That didn't answer my question, but it felt like all the answer I was going to get. I paid for the journal and left, tucking it under my arm as I stepped back into the thick, humid air. The first drops of rain were starting to fall, catching the light in strange ways, and for a moment, I swore I saw them bend. I was folding laundry when the ceiling developed a zipper. I don't mean a metaphorical zipper, like a sudden crack or a beam of light pouring through. I mean an actual zipper, teeth gleaming silver against the plain white drywall, running diagonally from one corner of the room to the other. For a moment, I just stared at it, holding a pair of mismatched socks, trying to figure out if I'd accidentally inhaled detergent fumes. But no, there it was, as real as anything else in the room. It didn't stop there, either. A second zipper appeared, this one tracing a zigzag pattern along the far wall. Then another across the carpet. They weren't there one moment, and then zip, they were. I dropped the socks, which now felt like the least important thing in the world, and backed away slowly, watching as the zippers began to twitch. One of them wriggled a little, as if testing itself. Then it started to unzip. Now, when a zipper unzips, you expect fabric, maybe a jacket or a suitcase. You don't expect to see sky, but that's what was behind it. A deep, endless blue, the kind of sky that doesn't belong in the middle of a living room. I could hear the wind rushing faintly through the opening, and I swear I caught a whiff of something. Flowers? Salt water? Freedom? Then the zipper on the wall started moving too, revealing a forest, dense, dark, and alive, with leaves that shimmered like emeralds and strange glowing fruit hanging from every branch. And just as I was starting to process that, the floor zipper unzipped itself completely, opening up to what appeared to be a churning ocean, waves crashing violently against jagged rocks. I jumped back, nearly tripping over the pile of laundry as a spray of seawater misted the air. I stood there, surrounded by portals to places that shouldn't exist, my heart racing like I just sprinted a mile. This wasn't normal. This wasn't even dream normal. And yet, as insane as it all seemed, I didn't feel scared. Not really. I felt curious, like I'd just been handed a puzzle with no instructions but endless possibilities. That's when the voice spoke, low, calm, and vaguely amused. "Well, are you going to pick one?" I spun around, looking for the source, but there was no one there. Just my couch, my half-folded laundry, and the impossible landscapes peeking through the zippers. "Pick what?" I said, feeling more than a little ridiculous talking to an empty room. "One door," the voice replied, as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. "One path, one story. The zippers don't stay open forever, you know?" I frowned. "Who are you?" "Let's not waste time on trivial questions," the voice said lightly. "What matters is the choice." "Choice for what?" I asked, frustrated. "Where do these even go?" The voice chuckled. "That's for you to find out." Before I could respond, the zipper on the ceiling shifted, as if to remind me of its presence. The endless blue sky beyond it rippled, and for just a second, I thought I saw something flying past. Something enormous, with wings that shimmered like glass. My stomach flipped, but not in a bad way. It flipped the way it does when you're at the top of a roller coaster, right before the drop. I looked at the forest. The fruit on the glowing trees swayed gently, even though there didn't seem to be any wind. One of the glowing fruits broke off and fell, landing silently on the forest floor. As it hit the ground, it burst like a bubble, releasing a puff of golden mist. I swear I saw the shape of a face in the mist, laughing, before it dissolved. Then there was the ocean. The waves surged and crashed with a raw, relentless power that made me feel small just looking at them. But there was something else out there, too. Something moving beneath the surface. I caught glimpses of it between the waves. A shadow, sleek and massive, circling like it was waiting for someone to dive in. "You can't stand there forever," the voice said, its tone tinged with impatience. "Doors don't wait." I hesitated, my eyes darting between the three choices. The sky, the forest, the ocean. Each one felt like it was pulling at me in a different way, like they all knew something I didn't. How was I supposed to pick? What if I chose wrong? What if I... "Oh, for crying out loud," the voice interrupted, sounding thoroughly unimpressed with my existential crisis. "You can't mess this up. Just choose. It's the journey that matters." "That's easy for you to say," I muttered, still trying to make up my mind. The voice didn't respond this time, which somehow made it worse. Finally, I stepped forward, my heart hammering in my chest, and reached for the zipper to the sky. I don't know why I picked it. Maybe it was the glimpse of wings. Maybe it was the endless blue, promising something open and boundless. Or maybe I just figured, if I was going to throw myself into the unknown, I might as well aim high. The moment I touched the zipper, everything shifted. I felt weightless, like I'd stepped off a cliff but hadn't started falling yet. The room dissolved around me, and suddenly, I was there. Wherever there was. The ground beneath me wasn't ground at all, but a series of floating, translucent platforms that stretched out into infinity. Each one glowed faintly, like glass lit from within. Above me, the sky was alive with movement. Enormous creatures with wings of light swooped and spiraled, their cries echoing like music. One of them landed on a nearby platform, its wings folding neatly against its body. It looked at me with eyes that seemed to contain entire galaxies, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Then it spoke, not with words, but with something deeper, a voice that resonated in my very bones. "You chose flight," it said. "Good. I didn't know what I was choosing," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "You chose all the same," it replied. "And now your story begins." Before I could ask what that meant, the platform beneath me started to dissolve, and I felt myself falling up into the endless sky, the world spinning around me in a kaleidoscope of light and sound. I wasn't scared. I wasn't even confused. I was alive. And that's when I realized the voice had been right. It wasn't about where the zippers led. It was about the leap, the choice, the story waiting to be written. So now I have to ask, if your ceiling developed a zipper and it opened to a place you couldn't explain, would you pull it? And if you did, where would you go? The ocean was in my mailbox. Not just water, but the entire ocean. Tides, currents, salt, fish, shipwrecks, and mysteries too deep to name. All folded neatly into the metal rectangle bolted outside my apartment door. I noticed it on a Monday morning, when the sky was still gray and my coffee hadn't yet kicked in. The flap of the mailbox was trembling slightly, like something inside was breathing. When I opened it, expecting maybe another catalog or a notice about a rent increase, I was met with the unmistakable scent of brine, that sharp tang of salt and wind that usually only comes with standing on a pier. I blinked, leaned in closer, and heard the soft crash of waves. At first, I thought I was losing it. Long weekend? Stress? Maybe some elaborate prank? But when I reached in, my fingers came back wet. Not damp, wet. I wiped them on my jeans, bent closer, and peered inside. There it was. An endless expanse of water stretching beyond the limits of sight, shimmering under a distant, unseen sun. Tiny waves lapped against the inside walls of the mailbox, and I could swear I saw the outline of a tiny, impossibly distant horizon. A seagull squawked somewhere inside. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring, waiting for reality to click back into place. It didn't. Instead, a small, dark object bobbed to the surface and floated toward the edge of the mailbox, bumping lightly against the lip. It was a message in a bottle. Of course it was. With shaking hands, I reached in and fished it out. The bottle was smooth, impossibly cold, and the cork at the top had been sealed with a blob of red wax. Inside, a tightly rolled piece of paper sat waiting. I uncorked it, unrolled the paper, and read the words scrawled in uneven handwriting. "Dear resident, you've been chosen as the keeper. Do not ignore the tides." That was it. No signature, no instructions, no contact number for oceanic customer support. I turned the paper over, hoping for some clarification, but the back was blank. I looked at the ocean in my mailbox again, half expecting it to say something, but it just waited. I took the bottle and the note inside, closing the mailbox carefully as if sealing in something alive. I told myself I'd deal with it later, maybe after work, maybe after a stiff drink. But the moment I stepped back into my apartment, I knew I wouldn't be able to think about anything else. I spent the rest of the morning pacing my tiny living room, the bottle in one hand and the note in the other, trying to wrap my head around what keeper was supposed to mean. Keeper of what? The ocean? How did that even work? Did I have to water it? Feed it? By noon, curiosity won out. I grabbed a flashlight, marched back to the mailbox, and flung it open. The ocean was still there, vast and unknowable, as though it had always been waiting for me. "Okay," I said out loud, more to myself than to the water. "What am I supposed to do with you?" The mailbox didn't respond. I leaned in further, shining the flashlight across the water's surface. Something flickered just below, a glimmer of movement. Before I could react, a tiny boat burst through the waves, skimming across the water like a toy. It was no larger than a shoebox, with a single sail that rippled in a non-existent breeze. The boat bumped gently against the lip of the mailbox, and as it rocked, I saw a figure standing on the deck. A person, no taller than a pencil. They were wearing a coat that billowed dramatically behind them and a hat with a feather that seemed too big for their head. "Ahoy!" the figure shouted. their voice surprisingly deep for someone so small. "Keeper, we've been expecting you." "Have you, though?" I muttered, blinking at them. "Yes," the tiny sailor barked, as though I'd insulted them. "Now, if you don't mind, there's no time to waste. The ocean is restless, and you've been charged with its care. Shall we begin?" "Begin what?" I asked, incredulous. The sailor sighed, as if explaining something very obvious to someone very slow. "The ocean doesn't tend itself, Keeper. There are storms to calm, currents to steer, creatures to protect. You'll need to manage the tides, of course, and mediate disputes between the krakens and the whales." "They're at it again." "Again?" "Yes, again. It's a whole thing. You'll see soon enough. Now, are you coming, or must I do this all myself?" The sailor gestured impatiently toward the boat, and I stared at them like they'd just asked me to climb into a blender. "I can't fit in there," I said. The sailor smirked. "Oh, you'd be surprised." Before I could argue, the boat's sail snapped to attention, catching a gust of wind that didn't exist. A swell of water rose from the mailbox, and the next thing I knew, I was falling. Not onto the street outside my apartment, but into the mailbox itself. I landed in the boat with a thud, soaking wet and surrounded by an ocean that stretched in every direction. The mailbox, my street, my entire world, had disappeared. The sailors stood beside me, no longer pencil-sized but eye-level, their feathered hat casting a sharp shadow across their face. "Welcome aboard, Keeper," they said with a grin. "We've got work to do." I should have been panicking. I should have been screaming about physics and space and whether or not I was having some kind of psychotic break. But as I looked out over the endless expanse of water, I felt calm, like I belonged here, even though I didn't understand why. The sailor handed me a map, an old, yellowed thing covered in markings I couldn't read. "First stop," they said, pointing to a storm brewing on the horizon. "That's the maelstrom. She's a bit testy today. We'll need to coax her into calming down before she floods the southern reefs. Think you can manage?" I stared at the map, then at the storm, then back at the sailor. "I have no idea what I'm doing." "Good," they said, adjusting their hat. "That's the first rule of being a keeper. Nobody ever does." And with that, the boat lurched forward, cutting through the waves like a knife. "So, tell me, if the ocean showed up in your mailbox, would you dive in? Or would you let the tides figure themselves out?" There's a street in my city that I avoid. It doesn't have a bad reputation, no crime statistics to back up my wariness, and nothing about it screams danger. It's just unsettling. It's only a block long, connecting two busier streets, lined with those narrow brick townhouses that all seem to blend into one another. Nothing about it should stand out, but it does. I can't quite explain why. Maybe it's the way the air feels heavier there, or the fact that it's always just a little quieter than it should be, like sound doesn't travel right. For years, I took the long way around without thinking too much about it. I told myself it was just my imagination, one of those irrational dislikes you pick up and carry with you without question. But a few months ago, when I was running late for a meeting on the other side of town, I broke my own rule. My shortcut saved me 10 minutes, but it also changed everything. The moment I turned onto the street, I felt it, the shift. It wasn't dramatic, nothing you'd notice if you weren't paying attention, but I was. The air was still and heavy, pressing down like a damp cloth, and the sound of my footsteps felt oddly muted, swallowed by the pavement. I told myself I was being ridiculous and kept walking, focusing on the far end of the block where the street opened back up to the bustling city. About halfway down, I noticed something strange. One of the houses had a door that didn't match the rest. Most of them had standard brown or black doors with brass knockers and peeling paint, but this one was deep red, almost the color of blood, with an ornate, swirling design carved into the wood. It was subtle, the kind of detail you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. But once I saw it, I couldn't look away. The house itself wasn't any different from the others. Same narrow shape, same gray brick. But the door felt alive. It wasn't just the color or the carvings. It was the way it seemed to hum, almost imperceptibly, like it was vibrating in place. I stopped walking. There was no logical reason for it. No sound, no movement, but every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around and leave. I should have, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped closer, drawn in by something I couldn't name. The carvings weren't random swirls like I'd thought. They formed patterns, twisting vines, blooming flowers, and something else, something darker, lurking in the spaces between. I reached out before I even realized what I was doing, my hand hovering just above the surface of the wood. It was warm, almost uncomfortably so, as if it had been sitting in direct sunlight, even though the entire street was shaded. And then, as I stood there, the door opened. Just a crack, enough for me to see the sliver of darkness inside. I should have stepped back. I should have run. But instead, I did the unthinkable. I pushed it open. The air inside smelled of lavender and smoke, a sharp, earthy scent that made my head spin. The hallway was narrow, dimly lit by a single flickering candle that rested on a small wooden table. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, black and white and faded with time. At first, I thought they were of random people. Families smiling stiffly, men in uniform, women in vintage dresses. But as I looked closer, my chest tightened. I recognized some of them, not their faces, but the places they stood. Parks, streets, and buildings from my own neighborhood, decades older but unmistakable. I should have left right then. Every rational part of me was screaming to get out. But there was something about the house, about the air, about the way the candle's light danced on the walls, that felt like it was pulling me forward. And so I walked deeper into the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway led to a room, a small, windowless space that felt much larger than it should have. The walls were lined with shelves, and the shelves were filled with objects: a rusted pocket watch, a child's shoe, a book with no title. At the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a single object, a silver bell, small and tarnished, with a handle that looked like twisted vines. I hesitated, the weight of the air pressing down on me. The bell seemed ordinary enough, but it radiated something, an energy I could feel in my chest, in my teeth. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. My hand closed around the handle, and before I could think, I rang it. The sound wasn't loud. It was soft, almost musical, but it rippled through the room like a stone dropped in water. The shelves seemed to shift, the objects vibrating faintly, and then, one by one, the photographs began to fall from the walls. They fluttered to the ground like dead leaves, and where they'd been, the wallpaper was covered in writing, long, looping lines of text in a language I didn't recognize. I stepped back, heart pounding, but the bell was still in my hand. The writing on the walls began to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. And then I heard it, footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming from the hallway behind me. I turned, but the hall was empty. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just at the threshold of the room. A voice, low and raspy, whispered, "You shouldn't have come." I don't remember running. I don't remember leaving the house or stepping back onto the street. All I know is that I was suddenly outside, the red door shut tightly behind me. The street was empty, quiet as ever, but the bell was still in my hand, its metal cool now, as if it had never been touched. I haven't gone back to that street. I don't even walk in that direction anymore. The bell sits on my nightstand, untouched but impossible to ignore. Sometimes, at night, I hear it ring faintly, even though I know I haven't touched it. And sometimes, when I wake up, the photographs from the walls of that house flash in my mind. Faces I've started to see in the streets, in the parks, in the reflections of windows as I pass. I don't know what that house was or why the door opened for me, but I know this. Some things are meant to be left alone. Some doors should never be opened. And yet, I can't bring myself to get rid of the bell. Not yet. Have you ever found something you wish you could forget, but know you never will? Something that left a mark on you, even if no one else can see it? The town had one of those tiny museums that no one talks about, but everyone vaguely knows exists. It sat on a side street. No one really walked down unless they were lost. Its front door painted a shade of green that had faded into an almost gray over the years. The sign above it read, in peeling gold letters, "The Museum of Almost Forgotten Things." I'd passed it dozens of times but never gone in. It seemed like the kind of place that might be dusty and disappointing, full of broken knickknacks someone's grandmother had refused to throw away. But last Sunday, I found myself standing outside its door. It had been a long, restless morning. The kind where even your thoughts feel itchy, like you can't sit still or focus on anything for more than a minute. I don't know why I stopped, but I did. There was a faint light glowing through the windows, and a little cardboard sign hung on the door that said simply, "Open." I had nowhere to be, so I pushed the door open. The bell above it gave a small, half-hearted jingle as I stepped inside. The air was warm and smelled faintly of wood polish and something sweeter, like cloves or cinnamon. It wasn't dusty, as I'd imagined, but clean in a way that felt intentional, like someone had lovingly wiped down every surface that morning. The room wasn't big, just one long space with shelves and glass cases running down either side. The ceiling was low, and the floor creaked beneath my feet as I moved. The man behind the counter didn't look up right away. He was sitting on a high stool, completely absorbed in something he was holding in his hands. From where I stood, it looked like a brass doorknob, but he was turning it over as though it were a jewel, his fingers brushing over its surface with careful precision. His hair was silvery gray, cropped short, and he wore a vest over a crisp white shirt, like he'd stepped out of another century. "Hello?" I said, half expecting the sound of my voice to startle him. It didn't. He glanced up, smiling faintly, and set the doorknob down on the counter. "Welcome," he said, his voice soft but not quiet, the kind of voice that made you feel like you'd been invited into someone's home. "First visit?" "Yeah," I said. What's this place about?" His smile widened, but only a little. "It's about the things people almost forget, or wish they hadn't." He gestured toward the shelves. "Feel free to look around." I wasn't sure what to make of that, but I nodded and stepped closer to the nearest shelf. The items on display weren't labeled, and there didn't seem to be any particular order to them. On one shelf, there was a tarnished pocket watch with a crack across its face, sitting next to a single leather glove. On another, a child's spinning top with its paint mostly worn off rested beside a tiny glass jar filled with what looked like dried flowers. Everything looked old, but not in a decrepit way. More like they'd been carried through time by careful hands. I stopped at a glass case in the middle of the room. Inside was an odd assortment of objects. A chipped teacup, a feather pin with its quill slightly bent, a playing card with the corner torn off, and a photograph of a man and woman standing under an umbrella. The rain in the photo was blurred, streaking the image like the camera lens had been wet. The couple wasn't smiling, but they weren't unhappy either. They just looked expectant, like something important was about to happen just out of frame. "What's the story with these?" I asked, glancing back at the man behind the counter. He raised an eyebrow, like he was pleased I'd asked. That's the thing, isn't it? Every item here has a story, but the story isn't mine to tell." I frowned. "Whose is it then?" "Yours, if you like." He got up from his stool and walked over, his hands clasped behind his back. "These are things people bring here because they don't know what else to do with them. Sometimes they're trying to forget. Sometimes they're trying to remember. Either way, they leave them here, and it's up to whoever finds them to decide what they mean." I stared at the items in the case again, feeling a strange pull toward the photograph. I didn't know why, but I wanted to know who the couple was, where they were going, why they'd stopped in the rain to have their picture taken. I wanted to know if they'd stayed together or drifted apart, if they remembered this moment as clearly as the photograph preserved it, or if it had become one of those half-faded memories that only surfaces in dreams. I moved to another shelf. There was an old key with no obvious lock, a pressed coin from a carnival, and a folded piece of paper that had been taped shut, its contents hidden. Beside it sat a cracked mirror, no larger than the palm of my hand. When I tilted my head to look into it, the reflection was slightly warped, the edges of my face curving inward like the mirror was trying to hold me in. "People bring these things to you?" I asked. "They do," he said. "Most of them don't explain why. Some cry when they hand them over. Others laugh, like they've just freed themselves from something heavy. But all of them say the same thing when they leave: it's yours now." I glanced at him. "Yours or the museum's?" He tilted his head, considering the question, "Is there a difference?" I didn't know how to answer that, so I didn't. Instead, I walked to the farthest shelf, where a single object sat in the middle of an otherwise empty space. It was a snow globe, the kind you might buy as a cheap souvenir, but the water inside was cloudy, and whatever scene had once been encased in it was now just a vague, shadowy shape. When I picked it up, I could hear the faintest slosh of liquid, as though the snowstorm had long since melted. "Take it if you like," the man said, his voice closer than I expected. I turned and saw him standing a few feet behind me, watching me with a quiet intensity. "Take it," I echoed. "Everything here is for the taking," he said. "But once it's yours, it's yours. You can't bring it back." I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the base of the globe. Why would I want it? He smiled again, that faint, enigmatic smile. "Maybe you already do." I didn't take the snow globe. I set it back on the shelf and left the museum, my head buzzing with questions I couldn't quite put into words. But now, days later, I can't stop thinking about it. About the man and his odd little museum, about the objects and their hidden stories, and about the strange feeling that if I went back, there might be something waiting for me, something I didn't know I'd lost. There's a place I go when I need to think. It's not on any map, and I couldn't give you directions if you asked. It's one of those places that only exists when you're not looking for it. If I had to describe it, I'd say it's somewhere between the river and the train tracks, in the shadows of buildings that never seem to hold the same shape twice. The entrance is a narrow iron gate, rusted and hanging slightly ajar. I stumbled across it years ago, and every time I return, it feels like the city rearranges itself just to let me in. Today, the air felt heavier, like it was carrying a secret it didn't want to tell. I slipped through the gate and followed the overgrown path, the kind that seemed to grow wild on purpose, leaves brushing my arms like whispers. The place beyond the gate always looks different, though it has the same feeling, like something waiting to exhale. The sound of water greeted me first, a slow, steady trickle like an unhurried clock. It was coming from a fountain in the center of the clearing, though I don't remember it being there last time. The fountain was strange, a tall, twisted column with carvings that didn't make sense. Not abstract, exactly, but shifting, like the shapes were caught halfway between being something and being nothing. The sun was low, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. I sat on the edge of the fountain, dipping my fingers into the water. It was colder than I expected, almost startlingly so. When I pulled my hand back, something clung to my fingertips, a fine, silver shimmer that caught the fading light. I wiped it on my jeans, but the shimmer didn't fade. It stayed there, catching the light with every movement, like I'd brushed against starlight. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the tall grass. At first, I thought she might have been a statue. Her stillness was uncanny, and the light caught her hair in a way that made it seem almost metallic. But then she moved, stepping forward with a grace that felt practiced, deliberate. She wore a dress the color of storm clouds, her feet bare, her arms hanging loosely at her sides. She didn't look at me right away, her gaze fixed on the fountain as though it held the answer to some unspoken question. "You're not supposed to be here," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. I blinked, caught off guard. "I've been here before." She turned to me then, her eyes a shade of gray so sharp it felt like they could cut through me. "Not this here." The way she said it sent a shiver through me. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but something told me she wouldn't explain, at least not in a way I'd understand. Instead, she walked to the fountain and ran her fingers along its edge, the same way I had. Her hand came away shimmering, the same silver sheen clinging to her skin. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, holding up her hand. I shook my head, unsure if she wanted an answer or was just testing me. "It's time," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Raw time. The kind that hasn't decided what it's going to be yet." I laughed, though it came out awkward and hollow. "Time isn't something you can touch." She smiled faintly, like she'd heard that before. "Not usually. But this place isn't usual, is it?" I didn't have a response to that. She crouched by the fountain, dipping both hands into the water. When she stood again, the silver shimmer coated her forearms, dripping slowly like mercury. She walked toward me, her movements slow and deliberate. "Hold out your hand," she said. Everything in me screamed not to, but I did it anyway. She reached out, pressing her palm to mine, and the moment her skin touched mine, the world cracked open. It wasn't like a vision, not exactly. It was more like falling into a kaleidoscope, fractured images spinning around me, too fast to make sense of. A boy running through a field of golden wheat. A clock smashed on the floor. A woman standing on the edge of a cliff, her face turned toward a storm. Fireworks exploding over a dark lake. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The clearing came rushing back, the air too sharp, the light too bright. I stumbled back, my chest tight, my heart hammering. What the hell was that? I demanded. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. A gift, or a curse. It depends on what you do with it. I looked down at my hand, expecting to see it shimmering with silver, but it was clean, normal. What am I supposed to do with it? "That's up to you," she said, stepping back toward the fountain. "But don't waste it. Wasted time tends to bite back." Before I could ask her what that meant, she stepped into the fountain. Not onto the edge, but into the water itself, her dress billowing around her. The silver shimmer climbed up her legs, her torso, until she was entirely coated in it, her form dissolving into the water like smoke. I stood there, staring at the empty fountain, the water still rippling from where she'd disappeared. The air felt heavier again, as though the clearing was exhaling for the first time. I left without looking back, though I felt the weight of the place pressing against my shoulders. When I got home, I noticed something strange. The clock on my wall, which had been stuck for months, was ticking again. Slow, deliberate, each second landing with a weight that felt almost alive. And then there were the dreams. Every night since, I've dreamed of moments that aren't mine. Lives I haven't lived, places I've never been, decisions I haven't made. Sometimes they're beautiful, sometimes terrible, but they all feel real. Too real. I don't go back to the gate anymore. But some nights, when the dreams are especially vivid, I wake up with my hand shimmering faintly, just for a moment, before it fades. I don't know what to do with it, but I'm afraid of what might happen if I don't figure it out. Have you ever felt like you were handed something too big, too strange, too alive to fully understand? And what did you do with it? When I opened my fridge that morning, there was a man inside. He was wearing a perfectly tailored suit, a tiny pocket square folded neatly against his chest, and a name tag pinned to his lapel that read, "Elliot, Refrigeration Consultant." He sat cross-legged on the top shelf, between the Greek yogurt and last night's leftover lasagna. He was sipping something out of one of my mismatched coffee mugs, the steam curling upward like he'd just brewed it fresh inside my fridge. "You're out of eggs," he said, not even looking up from his drink. His tone wasn't rude, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the kind of matter-of-fact delivery you get from someone whose entire personality revolves around punctuality and spreadsheets. I stood there, gripping the fridge door, my brain lagging several seconds behind reality. What? Who? "Elliot," he said, tapping his name tag. "You really ought to label your leftovers, by the way. That casserole in the back? Could go either way. Food poisoning roulette, I'd call it." I blinked at him, unsure whether I was hallucinating or still dreaming. Why? Why are you in my fridge?" He finally looked up, raising an eyebrow like I just asked why the sun rises in the east. "Because you need help." "Help? With your fridge," he clarified, waving his mug around for emphasis. "It's chaos in here. Unlabeled containers, half-empty condiment bottles, a rogue bag of wilted spinach shoved in the crisper like it's in witness protection. This isn't a fridge. It's an existential crisis waiting to happen." "Okay," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm because I had no idea what the protocol was for kicking a man out of your fridge. "But why you? Why are you the one helping?" Elliot sipped his coffee, or whatever it was, and gave me a pitying look. "Because this is my job. I'm a refrigeration consultant. I specialize in turning disasters like yours into functional, organized masterpieces. Think of me as Marie Kondo, but colder. This was absurd. This was beyond absurd. And yet, there he was, casually adjusting his tie while sitting among my perishables like this was the most natural thing in the world. I reached for the lasagna, partly because I wanted breakfast, and partly because I wanted to see if touching anything would make him disappear. Elliot sighed loudly. Leftovers for breakfast? Bold choice. You could at least reheat it. Or, make something fresh for once. Are you judging my eating habits? I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop myself. Only because they're terrible, he replied, shrugging. When's the last time you ate a vegetable that wasn't drenched in ranch dressing? Do pickles count? No, he said flatly. At this point, I wasn't even mad. I was impressed. Whoever Elliot was, he had committed hard to whatever bit this was, and part of me was curious to see how far he'd take it. Fine, I said, crossing my arms. If you're such an expert, what exactly do you suggest I do with my fridge? Elliot perked up immediately, setting down his mug and reaching into the fridge like he'd been waiting for me to ask. He pulled out a jar of mustard, nearly empty, crusted around the edges, and held it up like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom trial. This, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Why is this still here? Are you planning to scrape out the last half teaspoon with a toothpick? No, you're not. You're keeping it because you think you'll use it, but you won't. Throw it away. Before I could respond, he grabbed a plastic container of something unidentifiable, peered inside, and wrinkled his nose. And this? What even is this? Soup? Sauce? Something that used to be alive? Whatever it is, it's science now. Toss it. I was going to get to that, I muttered, feeling oddly defensive. Sure you were, he said, clearly unconvinced. For the next 10 minutes, I stood there like a deer in headlights as Elliot launched into a full-blown lecture about fridge organization. He talked about optimal shelf placement, the importance of airflow, and the necessity of a weekly purge. At one point, he even pulled out a clipboard. Where he'd gotten it, I had no idea, and started sketching a diagram of how my fridge should look. Condiments go in the door, he said, pointing at his clipboard like I was taking notes. Produce in the crisper. Dairy on the middle shelf. Proteins at the bottom. It's not rocket science, it's just logic. Okay, but... Also, he interrupted, stop putting bananas in here. They don't belong in the fridge. I like cold bananas, I said, which was apparently the wrong thing to say, because Elliot looked at me like I just confessed to a murder. This is why you need me, he said solemnly. Somewhere between the banana shaming and the part where he reorganized my yogurt by expiration date, I started to feel embarrassed. Not just because my fridge was a mess, but because Elliot was right. I was the kind of person who kept empty mustard jars and forgot about mystery Tupperware until it grew its own ecosystem. But there was also something oddly comforting about his presence. Sure, he was bossy, and yeah, he was literally living in my fridge for reasons I still couldn't comprehend, but he also seemed genuinely invested in making my life better, or at least my fridge better. When he finally hopped down from the shelf and dusted off his suit, why would a man in a fridge have dust? He gave me a satisfied nod. There, he said. Much better. The fridge did look better. Cleaner. More spacious. More functional. You're welcome, Elliot added, clearly expecting some sort of gratitude. Thanks, I guess, I said, still half convinced I was dreaming. He straightened his tie, grabbed his mug, and started climbing back onto the shelf like he was settling in for a long nap. I'll check back in a week, he said, waving me off. And don't think I won't notice if you let it slide again. I closed the fridge door slowly, half expecting him to pop back out and scold me for slamming it. But it stayed shut. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about Elliot. Was he real? Was I losing my mind? Or was this just some deeply specific cosmic intervention? The universe sending me a tiny, overbearing man to help me get my act together, one condiment at a time? I don't know, but I did throw out the mustard jar. When I like someone, I develop what I've come to call emotional archaeology syndrome. It's this bizarre compulsion to uncover every tiny, insignificant detail about their life. Like I'm piecing together the ruins of some ancient civilization that is, well, them. To be clear, I'm not stalking anyone. It's not creepy. It's more like I take this deep, unshakable interest in their story, in all the little fragments that make up who they are, and then I get lost trying to construct some grand narrative about them in my head. It usually starts innocently enough. Let's say I meet someone new, like this woman I've recently been chatting with at my rock climbing gym. Her name is Claire, and she's got this laid-back, confident energy, like the kind of person who's never once in her life tripped over a shoelace or spilled coffee on themselves. She's funny in this quiet, almost effortless way, the kind of person who doesn't even have to try. Naturally, I develop a massive crush, and naturally, the emotional archaeology begins. The first thing I noticed about Claire, aside from her ability to scale a wall like she's auditioning for Mission Impossible, was her water bottle. It's covered in stickers, faded ones, like they've been there for years. There's a sticker from some tiny coffee shop in Oregon, a cartoon raccoon holding a slice of pizza, and one that says, "Not all who wander are lost," which is so cliche it loops back around to being endearing. I find myself wondering about the story behind each sticker. Did she get the Oregon coffee shop one on a road trip? Is the raccoon an inside joke? Does she actually love pizza? Or did someone give it to her because they do? Then, during one of our brief chats, she casually mentioned she works as a wildlife photographer. And let me tell you, that single detail was like finding a gold coin in the dirt during a dig. My brain went into overdrive. Wildlife photography. What does that mean? Does she spend weeks in a tent in the wilderness, waiting for the perfect shot of a snow leopard? Does she have battle stories about fending off bears with a can of pepper spray? Is her apartment full of gorgeous black and white prints of elephants and hawks? Or is it hilariously cluttered with mismatched mugs and stacks of National Geographic magazines? I become obsessed with finding out more, but not by asking her directly. Oh no, that would be too simple. Instead, I construct these wild hypotheses based on tiny clues. Like the time I noticed her climbing shoes were caked with reddish dirt. My first thought wasn't, "Oh, she climbed somewhere dusty." No, it was, "That looks like desert sand. Maybe she just got back from a photo shoot in the Southwest. I bet she was photographing coyotes at sunrise." And then I spiraled into this imaginary story about Claire perched on a cliff at dawn, camera in hand, hair blowing in the wind, looking like a goddess of the wild. Totally normal, right? I get so caught up in this imaginary excavation of a person's life that it feels like I'm carrying around a tiny museum exhibit of them in my head. It's full of artifacts I've collected, some real, some speculative. Claire's exhibit would include the water bottle, the climbing shoes, and a mental image of her sitting in a Jeep somewhere, laughing with a field guide in her lap. There's a section dedicated to her laugh, which is this deep, warm sound, like a bear chuckling in a Pixar movie. And there'd definitely be a note card in the exhibit with big, speculative guesses like possible favorite animal, fox, or definitely prefers mountains over beaches. Here's the kicker, though. Once I've pieced together my mental version of someone, I start to feel this weird guilt, like I've accidentally trespassed on their life. There was this guy I dated for a while, Eli, and I did the same thing with him. He once mentioned he played the trumpet in high school, and the next thing I knew, I'd imagined an entire subplot where he was the brooding band kid who played jazz solos under the bleachers during football games. I even pictured him practicing late at night in his bedroom, lit by a single lamp, his parents shouting at him to keep it down. Then, months later, I casually asked him if he ever missed playing trumpet, and he looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Turns out, he hated it, only joined the band because his dad forced him to, and he quit the second he graduated. My entire Eli, the soulful jazz prodigy narrative, completely fabricated. The thing is, I don't do it because I'm not interested in the real person. It's actually the opposite. I get so fascinated by them that my imagination just fills in the gaps. It's like my brain can't handle the ambiguity of not knowing every detail, so it decides to create its own museum exhibit to fill the void. And let me tell you, once you've spent hours carefully curating an exhibit in your mind, it's hard to accept that the real thing might look totally different. With Claire, I've been trying to rein myself in, to remind myself that she's a person, not a puzzle to solve or a story to write. I even tried not looking at her water bottle during our last conversation, so I wouldn't spin off into another sticker origin deep dive. But then she mentioned she once got chased out of a swamp by an alligator, and my imagination went berserk. I mean, how am I not supposed to picture her sprinting out of a foggy bayou, camera slung over one shoulder, yelling something like, "Not today, death," while the gator glowers at her retreating figure? At this point, I know I'm doomed. I'll probably spend the next week wondering if she named the gator Gary, or if she now has a healthy fear of swamps, or if she secretly wishes she could go back and face the gator down, just to prove she's tougher than it is. But maybe, just maybe, I'll work up the courage to actually ask her about it next time I see her, to stop digging around in my own imagination and start letting her tell her story the way she wants to. That's the goal, anyway. But if she mentions another wild animal encounter, all bets are off. So, tell me, does anyone else do this? Do you ever catch yourself overanalyzing every little detail about someone you like, building them up in your head like they're some mythical figure? Please tell me I'm not the only one out here creating mental museums of people who don't even know they're on display. There's a room in my house that doesn't exist. At least, not in any way that makes sense. You won't find it on the floor plan. It doesn't show up if you pace the perimeter of the house or measure the walls. From the outside, it shouldn't be there. But it is. We call it the Monday room, because for reasons I still can't explain, you can only open the door on Monday nights, between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. Any other time, it's just a blank wall, smooth and unremarkable. If you didn't know it was there, you'd never suspect a thing. I found it by accident 3 years ago, when my partner and I were arguing over where to hang a painting we just bought. It was this big, abstract thing she'd fallen in love with at a local gallery, swirls of red and gold that made me dizzy if I stared at it too long. She insisted it would look perfect on the west wall of the living room. I disagreed. It wasn't an angry argument, just one of those back and forths where you're both stubborn for no good reason. At one point, frustrated, she pressed her palm against the wall as if trying to physically convince me of its suitability. That's when it happened. I remember the exact way her hand froze mid-gesture, how her head tilted ever so slightly as if she'd heard a sound I couldn't. "What's that?" she asked, stepping back. I frowned, about to tell her I didn't hear anything. But then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible outline in the plaster. A vertical seam, about the width of a door. We both stared at it, confused, until she reached out again and pressed her hand against the wall. This time, there was a quiet click, so soft I thought I'd imagined it, and the wall seemed to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a pebble. And then the door appeared. It wasn't a normal door. It didn't match any of the others in the house. This one was taller, almost imposing, painted a deep navy blue that didn't match the neutral tones of our walls. There was no doorknob, just a brass keyhole that seemed to shimmer faintly in the light. My first instinct was that it was some kind of weird installation left by the previous owners, a prank or an art piece we hadn't been warned about. But when I looked at her, I could tell she didn't believe that any more than I did. The door wouldn't open at first. We tried pushing, pulling, even leaning our full weight against it, but it wouldn't budge. She grabbed a flashlight and crouched down to peer through the keyhole, but whatever was on the other side was too dark to see. Eventually, frustrated and spooked, we gave up and decided to deal with it later. The next morning, the door was gone. Not just locked or sealed. It simply wasn't there anymore. The wall was smooth and seamless, as if it had never existed. For weeks, we thought we'd imagined the whole thing. We didn't talk about it much, except in brief, uneasy jokes. "Maybe the house is haunted," she'd say, smirking as she poured her coffee. "Maybe it's hiding a portal to Narnia." But I could tell it unsettled her as much as it did me. We were both trying to make sense of something that didn't fit into the neat little boxes we understood. Then, one Monday evening, it happened again. I was passing through the living room when I noticed the outline on the wall reappearing, faint at first, like a mirage sharpening into focus. I called her over, and together we watched as the door materialized again, exactly as it had the first time. This time, though, when she pressed her hand to the surface, the door swung open. The room beyond was small, maybe the size of a walk-in closet, and completely empty. The walls were a soft, dusky rose, the kind of color you'd see at sunset on a particularly calm evening. The floor was smooth, pale wood, and the air inside felt different. Not warmer or colder, but heavier somehow, like stepping into a space that wasn't entirely ours. There was no furniture, no windows, no sign of purpose. Just an empty, quiet room. We stepped inside, half expecting something to happen, but nothing did. No hidden mechanisms, no sudden appearances of strange creatures or messages from the beyond. It was just a room, and yet, standing there together, we both felt it, a strange sense of calm, as if we'd stumbled into a bubble of time that wasn't tethered to the rest of the world. We stayed there for a while, not talking, just existing in that space. Eventually, the air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and we stepped back into the living room. The door clicked shut behind us and vanished. That became our ritual. Every Monday night, if the door appeared, we'd step inside together. Sometimes we'd bring pillows and lie on the floor, staring up at the bare ceiling. Other times we'd sit cross-legged, facing each other, sharing things we hadn't said out loud yet. It became a space for the conversations we were too scared to have in the light of day. The what-ifs, the apologies, the confessions. Once, during a particularly hard week, she admitted she wasn't sure she loved her job anymore. I told her I'd been worried I wasn't the person she thought I was when we first met. We didn't always have answers for each other, but the room seemed to hold the weight of those admissions, making them feel less overwhelming. Over time, the room changed. Some Mondays, it smelled faintly of lavender, like someone had left a sachet in the corner. Other nights, the walls seemed to pulse with a dim, golden light, like a heartbeat. Once, we found a small wooden box sitting in the center of the floor. Inside was a folded piece of paper with the words, "Not yet," scrawled in a handwriting neither of us recognized. We tried to take the box with us, but it disappeared the moment we crossed the threshold back into the living room. We never told anyone about the room. Not our friends, not our families. It felt too strange, too personal, like a shared dream we couldn't risk breaking by inviting someone else into it. The Monday room became our refuge, a secret we carried together. And then, one Monday, the door didn't appear. We waited, sitting on the couch with the lights off, hoping it would materialize. But it never did. Weeks passed, then months, and still, the wall remained smooth and blank. At first, I was devastated. She was more optimistic, convinced it would return when we needed it most. But as the weeks turned into years, even she stopped mentioning it. Life went on. We painted the living room a new color, hung art on the wall where the door used to be, and tried to forget about it. But sometimes, on Monday nights, I still find myself glancing at that spot on the wall, half expecting to see the faint outline reappear. I don't know if it ever will, or if we've lost it for good. What I do know is that it left something behind. A quiet understanding that not every mystery needs solving, and not every door stays open forever. And maybe that's okay. Some things are meant to exist only in stolen hours. Some rooms are meant to live only in memory. When I first met Nora, I was convinced she didn't belong on this planet. She had this way about her, like she was perpetually distracted by some invisible conversation only she could hear. Her clothes never matched in any recognizable way. Striped tights, polka dot skirts, and sweaters with these obscure slogans like "The Moon Says Hi." She carried a backpack covered in patches, one of which was just the word radishes in big red letters. I wasn't sure if it was ironic or sincere, and honestly, it unnerved me. She felt like the human equivalent of static on a TV screen, buzzing with energy I didn't know how to interpret. We were assigned as partners in a cooking class. Not by choice, mind you. My roommate had dragged me to this culinary experience as part of his self-imposed journey to become a Food Network prodigy, and I'd reluctantly agreed because he promised free snacks. I thought I'd get to spend the night in quiet anonymity, chopping carrots or whatever. Then the instructor paired me with Nora, and my fate was sealed. She didn't introduce herself. She just looked at me, squinted like she was assessing a crime scene, and said, "Do you know how to knead dough? Or are you one of those people who thinks bagels come from vending machines?" I know how to knead dough," I lied. "Good," she said, tying an apron around her waist, "because I don't trust machines to make food. It feels dystopian." This was the first of many sentences she would say that evening that made me deeply uncomfortable. The task for the night was making ravioli from scratch. A simple enough concept, but it quickly became apparent that Nora had a very loose interpretation of the word recipe. While the instructor demonstrated how to roll out pasta dough and fill it with ricotta, Nora went rogue. She dumped an alarming amount of cayenne into the mix, followed by lemon zest and what I swear was nutmeg. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" I asked, watching her stir the filling like a mad scientist. She looked up at me, wide-eyed. "A good idea? Who comes to a cooking class for good ideas? We're here to make bad choices and find out if they're secretly genius." I had no rebuttal. By the time we finished, our ravioli looked like they had been designed by a committee of overexcited toddlers. Some were enormous, others tiny, and a few were inexplicably triangular. The instructor came by, took one look at our tray, and said, "Well, that's creative." Nora grinned like she'd just been handed a trophy. When it came time to taste the results, I braced myself. I fully expected her cayenne lemon nutmeg monstrosity to be inedible, maybe even mildly poisonous. But the first bite was confusing. It wasn't bad, exactly. It was bold and chaotic, and somehow worked in a way that felt like it shouldn't. "I think I might like it," I said reluctantly. "Of course you do," Nora replied, as if this had been a foregone conclusion. "You just didn't know it yet." After class, she asked if I wanted to grab a drink. I was so caught off guard that I said yes before my brain could catch up. We ended up at a dimly lit bar where she ordered a drink called Spicy Flamingo, and I stuck with a boring beer. She talked a mile a minute, jumping from topic to topic with no discernible transitions. One moment, she was telling me about the time she accidentally started a bonfire with a bag of marshmallows. The next, she was explaining her theory that humans are just overly complicated plants who forgot how to photosynthesize. I couldn't decide if she was brilliant or insane. Maybe both. At one point, I asked, "Do you always talk like this?" She paused, considering. "Like what?" "Like your brain is a pinball machine and someone just hit the jackpot." She laughed, a loud, unapologetic laugh that made the bartender glance over. "I like that," she said. "I'm stealing it." After that night, Nora just kept showing up in my life. She found me on social media and messaged me things like, "What's your favorite shape of cloud?" Personally, I'm a fan of the lopsided llama. She started inviting me to random events, an open mic night where she read a poem about the spiritual journey of a paperclip, a thrift store fashion competition, where we had to dress each other in the most ridiculous outfits we could find, a DIY pottery class where she made a lopsided bowl she proudly named Greg. At first, I went along with it out of sheer curiosity. I felt like an anthropologist studying a new species. But somewhere along the way, my confusion turned into something else. I found myself looking forward to her messages, her strange questions, her completely unfiltered way of existing. She made everything feel like an adventure, even the most mundane things. One afternoon, she dragged me to an abandoned train station she'd found while wandering with intent, as she called it. The place was covered in graffiti, and she immediately pulled out a bag of chalk. "We're making art," she announced, handing me a piece of blue chalk shaped like a dinosaur. I stared at her. "Isn't this technically trespassing?" "Only if we get caught," she said with a wink. I ended up drawing a terrible rendition of a cat, which she declared hauntingly profound. She drew a giant radish with a smiley face, then added a speech bubble that said, "Keep going, buddy." As we sat there, surrounded by our ridiculous creations, I realized I wasn't confused by Nora anymore. I was mesmerized. "You're not what I expected," I said. She looked at me, her head tilted like a curious bird. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone normal?" She grinned. "Normal is boring. You'd hate it." She was right, of course. Now, a year later, she's still the most bizarre, wonderful person I've ever met. Our apartment is filled with her eccentric projects, a collection of seashells she's labeled with imaginary species names, a series of abstract paintings titled The Chronicles of Greg, and a jar of what she claims is moonlight-infused honey. Don't ask. Sometimes I think back to that first cooking class and wonder how I ever mistook her for someone out of place. The truth is, she's exactly where she belongs. On this planet, in my life, turning everything ordinary into something extraordinary. Have you ever met someone who flipped your entire perception of the world upside down? When I opened my front door this morning, there was a perfectly round hole in the middle of my lawn. Not a crater, not a patch of missing grass, just a clean, black void about 6 feet across. It didn't cast a shadow or look like a pit. It was just nothing, as if someone had taken a giant cookie cutter and punched a hole through the fabric of reality. My first thought, naturally, was that it was the neighbor's dog. My second thought was that I really needed coffee before dealing with whatever this was. I closed the door, poured myself a cup, and tried to decide whether or not the void was my responsibility. It didn't seem threatening, exactly, but it also wasn't what you'd call neighborly. Still, ignoring it felt wrong. Like pretending you didn't see someone drop their wallet right in front of you. By the time I stepped back outside, the hole had grown a little wider. Not much, maybe an inch or two, but it was definitely bigger. More unsettling, though, was the fact that it had begun humming. The sound was low and faint, more vibration than noise, but I could feel it buzzing faintly in my teeth. "Morning," called Mrs. Fenwick from her porch across the street. She was holding her usual cup of tea, dressed in her usual floral bathrobe, and acting like there wasn't a literal hole in the world sitting in my yard. "Lovely day, isn't it?" I waved half-heartedly. Sure. You don't see anything weird over here?" She squinted at me, then at the hole. "Weird? No, dear. Just the usual." "Oh, except for the owl." "Owl?" "Yes, the one sitting on your roof. Quite handsome, really. I've never seen one that color before." I tilted my head back, and sure enough, there was an owl perched on the peak of my house. It was enormous, at least the size of a beach ball, with feathers the color of storm clouds and eyes that glowed faintly blue. It stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment, then swiveled its head 180 degrees to look at the hole. "Do you think it's your pet?" Mrs. Fenwick asked. "I don't think so." She shrugged. "Well, if it lays eggs, I'd love one. Nothing like a fresh owl egg in the morning." She wandered back inside before I could respond, leaving me alone with the owl and the void. I decided to call my boss to let them know I wouldn't be coming in today. "Is it the flu?" she asked, already exasperated. "No," I said. "There's a hole in my yard." There was a long silence. "Like a pothole?" "No," I said again. "Like a metaphysical hole. Or maybe existential. I'm not sure." "Right," she said slowly. "Feel better soon." The owl hooted once, sharp and impatient, as if to remind me it was still there. I glanced up at it, then down at the hole, which was now at least 7 feet across and pulsing faintly, like the heartbeat of some giant, unseen creature. "Okay," I muttered. "Fine. Let's deal with this." I grabbed a broom from the garage, not because I thought it would be useful, but because it felt better to approach the void armed with something, and step closer to the edge. Up close, it wasn't just black. It was deep. Not in the way that a well or a canyon is deep, but in the way that a thought can be deep or a feeling. The closer I got, the more it seemed to stretch, as if the hole was both inches away and miles across at the same time. I poked it with the broom. The broom's bristles vanished instantly, as if they'd been cut off with a razor. I yelped and stumbled back, clutching the mangled handle like a weapon. The void, for its part, seemed unfazed. The owl flapped its wings and swooped down from the roof, landing gracefully at the edge of the hole. It turned to look at me, its glowing eyes impossibly sharp, and said, "It's hungry." I dropped the broom. "What?" "The hole," the owl said, as if this were obvious. Its voice was low and resonant, with a faint echo that made it hard to tell if the words were coming from its beak or from inside my own head. "It's hungry. That's why it's here." What does it eat?" I asked, half expecting the owl to say brooms or clueless homeowners. The owl tilted its head, considering me. "Memories, mostly." "Memories?" "Yes. Stories, experiences, moments, things that linger. The hole feeds on them." I stared at the void, then at the owl. "That's insane." The owl blinked slowly, which I think was its way of saying, "And your alternative explanation is?" Before I could argue further, the void pulsed again, and a faint image flickered across its surface. It was my childhood bedroom. Peeling wallpaper, mismatched furniture, the smell of dust and crayons. For a moment, I could feel the memory as vividly as if I were back there. The rough texture of the carpet under my knees, the faint hum of a fan in the corner, the sound of my mother calling me to dinner. Then, just as quickly, the memory dissolved into the blackness, and I realized I couldn't remember what the room had looked like anymore. "See," said the owl. "Hungry." "Okay," I said, trying not to panic. "So how do I make it stop?" "You don't," the owl said simply. "You just choose what to give it." I looked at the void again. It was wider now, its edges creeping toward the house. The humming had grown louder, more insistent, like the ticking of a clock counting down. "Fine," I said. "Take the time I broke my arm in 5th grade. I don't need that one." The void rippled, and I felt the memory vanish. Not painfully, but completely, like a page torn cleanly from a book. The hole pulsed again, satisfied for the moment, but still hungry. I glanced at the owl, who was watching me with an unnerving intensity. "How much do I have to give it?" "As much as it takes," it said. By the time the sun began to set, the void was almost gone. It had taken my first kiss, my worst haircut, the day I graduated college, and the night I spent crying in the rain over someone who didn't love me back. It had even taken the clock on my lawn, though I barely remembered why that mattered. When the void finally closed, the owl ruffled its feathers and nodded approvingly. "Well done," it said. "You chose wisely." "What happens now?" I asked. The owl spread its wings, preparing to take off. "Now you live. A little lighter, perhaps. A little freer. Until the next hole appears." And then it was gone, leaving me alone in the fading light with a lawn that was somehow both emptier and fuller than it had been that morning. In the heart of the city, where glass towers pierced the clouds and shadows stretched long and lean across asphalt veins, a man named Caleb strolled into a pawn shop carrying a strange object wrapped in cloth. The shop, dimly lit and scented faintly of mildew and burnt dust, was the kind of place that seemed to absorb secrets. Shelves groaned under the weight of forgotten treasures. Tarnished brass instruments, outdated cameras, cracked porcelain dolls with lifeless eyes. Caleb stepped to the counter and placed the bundle down with deliberate care. The shopkeeper, a man whose presence was more shadow than substance, approached with curiosity. He unwound the cloth to reveal what lay beneath: a pocket watch. Its silver casing glimmered faintly, though it seemed untouched by polish. The watch face, etched with runes instead of numbers, ticked softly. The hands moved counterclockwise, their rhythm unsettling. "This," Caleb said, his voice flat but purposeful, "was given to me under strange circumstances. I'd like to sell it." The shopkeeper, whose name no one seemed to know, inspected the watch with gloved hands. He did not ask the usual questions. He did not need to. After a moment, he simply nodded and slid a wad of cash across the counter. Caleb took it without counting and left without another word. The bell over the door jingled faintly as it shut behind him. The shopkeeper placed the watch in a glass case among other oddities. A compass that spun wildly regardless of direction, a mirror that reflected rooms not visible in the shop, a chessboard where the pieces moved on their own. For a time, the pocket watch sat quietly, ticking backward as if counting down to something unseen. The next customer to notice the watch was Elise, a grad student who often wandered the shop in search of inspiration. She wrote speculative fiction, though she'd yet to finish a single manuscript, and she believed objects held stories. When she saw the watch, her breath caught. The intricate runes on the face seemed to glow faintly as her eyes traced them, though the shopkeeper assured her it was a trick of the light. "It's just an old watch," he said, though his tone was unconvincing. "Belonged to someone who didn't need it anymore." Elise bought it, pocketing her doubts with the change she received. That night, in her cramped apartment filled with half-empty coffee cups and stacks of overdue library books, she studied the watch under her desk lamp. The tick-tock filled the room with an odd sort of energy. It wasn't just sound. It was sensation, a faint vibration in her bones. She began dreaming of places she didn't recognize. Not nightmares, but vivid journeys. Each time she awoke, the runes on the watch seemed clearer, their shapes burning into her memory. When she began to sketch them obsessively in the margins of her notebooks, a pattern emerged. A star chart, unfamiliar but eerily precise. Driven by a compulsion she didn't fully understand, Elise took the sketches to her astronomy professor. He frowned as he studied them, muttering something about anomalies and alignments that defied current models. He promised to investigate further, though his eyes betrayed unease. Meanwhile, Elise's dreams grew stranger. She floated above cities carved from crystal, their spires glinting in an eternal twilight. She walked through forests where trees whispered secrets in languages she couldn't understand. Always, she carried the watch, though she could never remember picking it up. The turning point came on a Friday evening. Elise had fallen asleep at her desk, her face pressed against her sketches, the watch ticking beside her. She woke to a loud chime, sharp, reverberating. Disoriented, she reached for the watch. Its hands spun wildly now, the runes glowing brighter than before. And then it stopped. The silence was suffocating. Elise stared at the watch, her reflection warped in its polished surface. Slowly, cautiously, she pressed the latch to open it. Inside, instead of gears and springs, there was a void, an endless, pulsing darkness. It wasn't empty, though. Shapes moved within, indistinct but purposeful, like shadows cast by something monstrous yet unseen. A voice echoed in her mind, not heard but felt. The time has come. The room dissolved around her, replaced by a vast expanse of stars. She was weightless, suspended in an infinite night. Before her, a figure coalesced, a being of light and shadow, its form ever shifting. It regarded her not with eyes, but with a presence so profound it felt like drowning in knowledge. "You are the keeper now," it intoned. Its voice was the creaking of ancient wood, the roar of distant waves, the whisper of dying stars. "The watch binds you to the in-between, the hinge upon which worlds turn. Time is no longer your ally. It is your burden." Elise tried to speak, but her words were swallowed by the void. The being seemed to understand regardless. "Beware the temptations of the clock," it warned. "Every tick demands a price." And just as suddenly as it began, she was back in her apartment, the watch clutched tightly in her trembling hand. The room was unchanged, yet it felt altered. Shadows stretched longer. Time seemed slower, more deliberate. Over the following days, strange occurrences became routine. The watch would chime, and moments later, events unfolded exactly as the dreams foretold. A bird crashing through her window, a stranger collapsing on the sidewalk, a call from her professor who discovered the star chart matched no known constellations because they hadn't existed yet. Elise realized the watch wasn't just a timepiece. It was a gateway, a tether to something vast and incomprehensible. The runes began to glow at odd intervals, and she soon learned to fear their light. Each activation brought her closer to the in-between, to that pulsing void where shadows moved with intent. One night, as the watch ticked louder than ever before, she stood by her window, gazing at the city below. The world seemed fragile now, as if she could see the cracks in its foundation. Her grip tightened around the watch. She understood its power, but not its limits. When the chime came again, she didn't hesitate. She opened the watch, staring into its void, and whispered, "Show me." The world fractured, and Elise, the new keeper of the in-between, disappeared. The thing about the library at the end of the street is that it doesn't exist. Or, at least, not in the way that libraries usually exist. I don't mean it's a metaphor, like some poetic idea of infinite knowledge hiding in the shadows of an ordinary town. I mean it literally doesn't exist, not always, anyway. Some days, there's just an empty lot where it should be, a patch of gravel and weeds surrounded by a chain-link fence. But on other days, when the clouds hang low and the wind smells like something older than time, the library is there, waiting for anyone brave enough, or lost enough, to walk through its doors. Today was one of those days. I'd been wandering the neighborhood, hoping to shake off the restlessness that had been gnawing at me all week, when I saw it. The building wasn't large or imposing, like some grand cathedral of books. It was squat and brick, with ivy climbing up the walls and a sign over the door that simply read library. There was no address, no hours of operation, just the sign and the heavy oak door that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Except for today, of course. Today, the door was cracked open, just wide enough to let in a sliver of pale yellow light. It felt like an invitation, but not the friendly kind, more like a dare. I hesitated on the sidewalk, wondering if anyone else could see it. A man walking his dog passed by without so much as a glance in its direction. A kid on a bike rode straight through the lot as if the library wasn't even there. I took a deep breath and stepped closer, telling myself it was just a weird trick of the mind, a leftover daydream I hadn't quite shaken off. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the smell hit me first. Paper and dust and something sharp, like ozone before a storm. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, and the room was much larger than it had any right to be. Shelves stretched up toward a ceiling I couldn't see, each one crammed with books of every size and color imaginable. The titles on the spines didn't make sense. Some were in languages I didn't recognize. Others were symbols and shapes that twisted into new forms when I looked too closely. A woman sat behind the front desk, her hair piled high in a gray bun, her glasses balanced on the tip of her nose. She didn't look up as I approached, her fingers moving deftly over an abacus made of polished bone. "Hi," I said, my voice echoing faintly. She glanced at me over the top of her glasses. Her eyes were an unsettling shade of green, too bright to be real. "Looking for something specific?" I hesitated. "I didn't mean to, come in. I was just walking by." Her lips twitched into a faint smile. "No one comes here by accident, dear. The library doesn't show up for just anyone." I didn't know what to say to that, so I glanced around the room, trying to avoid her piercing gaze. The shelves seemed to shift as I looked at them, rearranging themselves subtly, as if they were alive and trying to decide what to show me. "Go on, then," the woman said, gesturing toward the stacks. "You might as well take a look. First book's always free." "Free?" She chuckled softly. "Well, not free, exactly, but payment comes later." I didn't love the sound of that, but curiosity was already pulling me deeper into the room. The aisles between the shelves felt narrower than they should, and the books seemed to lean toward me as I passed, their covers whispering faintly in the back of my mind. I reached out to touch one, a slim, leather-bound volume with no title, and felt a jolt of something electric zip through my fingers. "What are you?" I murmured, as if the book might answer. It didn't, but the whispering grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't help but open it. Inside, the pages were blank, except for a single line scrawled in handwriting that looked unnervingly like my own. "Do you remember the red bicycle?" I froze. I hadn't thought about the red bicycle in years. It had been my favorite when I was a kid, shiny and fast. The kind of bike that made you feel invincible. I'd lost it one summer, though I could never quite remember how. One day, it was just gone, as if it had vanished into thin air. The book hummed faintly in my hands, and the words on the page shifted. Now it said, "Would you like it back?" "What does that mean?" I whispered. The woman's voice came from right behind me, making me jump. "The library gives back what you've lost," she said. Her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. "Or, sometimes, it takes what you wish you could forget. Depends on the book." I turned to face her. "And what does it take in return?" Her smile widened, but it wasn't comforting. "That depends on you, dear. Every trade is different." I looked down at the book again, at the faint shimmer of the words on the page. The memory of the red bicycle was hazy, just a fragment of childhood, but the thought of holding it again, of feeling its handlebars in my hands, was intoxicating. But something about the library made my skin crawl, and I couldn't shake the feeling that once I opened the door to that memory, I might not be able to close it again. "No," I said, closing the book and setting it back on the shelf. "I don't think I need it." The woman's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, approval, maybe, or disappointment. "Suit yourself," she said. I made my way back to the entrance, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was still cracked open, the pale light spilling out into the evening gloom. Just before I stepped outside, I glanced back at the woman. She was already back at her desk, her fingers moving over the abacus. As I left, the library seemed to fold in on itself, collapsing quietly into nothingness until only the empty lot remained. The air smelled like gravel and weeds again, and the streetlights flickered on one by one. I walked home with the strange feeling that something had shifted inside me, though I couldn't say what. And when I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I thought about the red bicycle. Not the memory itself, but the idea of it, the weight of the choice I'd made. I haven't seen the library since that day, but sometimes, when the wind smells like old paper and forgotten things, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to walk through its doors. And if it is, I hope they choose wisely.